Hello and welcome to the Last Word on Spurs. We are your award-winning Tottenham Hotspur podcast. You know what time it is. We know what time it is. Look, I know for many out there, they already know what the time is. The summer transfer window is open here on Last Word on Spurs, officially, formally, and you know what that means. I'm joined alongside me by my co-host, my sidekick to come over the course of this summer. He's beaming a smile. He's got the Spurs stadium in his background. My wonderful co-host, Matty Hayes. I don't even call him Matt Hearn there. Matty Hayes returns. I've been so excited for him. I can't even get his name right. Matty, how are you, my man?
Oh, I'm absolutely fantastic, Ricky. Looking forward to, first of all, a fantastic show, but also what is hopefully going to be a big summer for Tottenham. And the best summers are always the ones that we get to cover here on Last Word on Spurs. So, yeah, I'm excited. I'm optimistic. I know that doesn't reflect the entire fan base, but I'm going into this with a smile on my face.
Absolutely, mate. Yeah, totally agree. Look, I know it's early. I know many are already out there saying, why haven't we signed any players? Why haven't we done any business? We have got Timo Werner over the line. I'm not going to even anger people even more if I say that. But Spurs have got one in. Yes, it is a loan. And I know whenever this man comes back on the show, there's always excitement. There's always joy. It means that business is definitely open for both January and the summer. It gives me my pleasure to welcome back to Last Word on Spurs, our award-winning podcast. Of course, broadcaster, journalist, Ben Jacobs returns. Ben, thank you so much for your time. Love to see you back on.
Absolute pleasure to be back. Thanks for having me. Had you won the award before or after I came on? Because if it was after, you might want to check if you've still got the award-winning title or whether my appearance has undone all of that hard work.
Listen, Ben, you got us over the line, I reckon. I think it was your appearance that got us over the line, so we can't thank you enough.
It's great to be here. And as I say, you guys do great work, always an engaging chat. And I'm looking forward to, I'm going to say an hour and a half. And I've given a bit more leeway this time because virtually every show I've done, I've had the dog. And after about an hour, pretty much when we get to the good stuff, the incomings, because you lure everyone in with a few questions about the squad. I don't want to give too much away. A few questions about those going. And then as we get to the sort of meat and the gravy or the roast chicken, whatever you want to call it, the bits that people really want, the dog just comes closer and closer and closer and closer. And then about an hour and 10 minutes in, I get a little paw on the leg and I think, okay, we need to wrap things up. This time, the dog in breaking news, if anyone cares, beautiful golden doodle called Winnie, she's out. She's peed. She's fast asleep. We've got as long as we like.
Let's hope we're going to need all that time, Ben. And let's say, cat's out of the bag now. Ben has gone and broken the magic formula of our scripts that we do in the background here of Last Word on Spurs. How can we forgive him, Matt, after that? Can we forgive him? There's better be a good hour and a half in store, right, Matt? He's just up the pressure.
Well, it's going to be a good hour and a half. So, I mean, I think I forgive him already.
Listen, we do. Listen, we'd like to have Ben alongside us here. Like I say, formally opening the transfer window here on Last Word on Spurs. Now, Ben did mention about us being award-winning. And I think it's only right that we give you guys the opportunity to see if you can make it and help us make it 2 in a row, because nominations have now formally opened for the second year running where you can nominate Last Word on Spurs for the Football Content Awards of 2024. Can you help us bring a trophy home for the second time there? And I'm sure Ben being on this show here is going to even help us even further drive that. You can do it right now by going to the QR code there or to our description link on both our audio and YouTube platforms and type Last Word on Spurs under Best Podcast in the Premier League. As always, we can't thank you enough for all your incredible support for the show. And without further ado, it's going to be a busy hour and a half. Lots are going to be coming your way. All the names you want to hear, both ins in terms of outs. We'll get a conclusive run-up, I'm sure. I'm going to hand over to the wonderful Matty Hayes. Got his name right second time round to start this show. Matty, over to you, my man.
Ben, we can't really speak about the transfer window coming up without talking about the changes that have been made to Tottenham's recruitment department since we last spoke to you in January. The summer window will, of course, be the first test of this new setup. And Scott Munn, who eventually started his role at the club, one of his first tasks as CFO was to pick up the pieces and rebuild what has been a tumultuous time for that recruitment department. His first job was to bring in a technical director, and Johan Lang emerged as the top target and got that job. As we all very well know, Munn in turn hired Rob McKenzie, who'd previously worked at Leicester and Tottenham before, to lead the recruitment, and Frederick Lett was appointed as the head of football research. On top of that, Fabio Paratici, we understand, still operates for the club on a consultancy basis. The recruitment department has gone through a dizzying amount of change in a short period. In your mind, how ready are Tottenham for the summer ahead, both in terms of managing incomings and being able to make some crucial sales as well?
Yeah, I think very ready. The beauty is they've not just appointed the right fits, but characters as well. And even if we date back to when Ange Postecoglou first came in and maybe the recruitment model was growing and relatively fluid and everyone was either new or in the case of Munn hadn't fully started, what was clear is the dynamic was right. And Ange Postecoglou can be very forthright, make no mistake. I think we saw that in the back end of the season in press conferences. It's not all just quips and insightful, frank knowledge. It's not just grounded and down to earth. Behind closed doors, there's a freedom to challenge. And that's what you want in a recruitment model like this. People perhaps wrongly think that decisiveness and yes people is the way to do quick business. And when everyone's on the same page, you get success. But you don't get to that, yes, we're moving for target X, unless you have a genuine freedom to challenge. And if there's too much of a hierarchy or if the balance is wrong, then the recruitment model fails. So Tottenham in their recruitment were very staggered in how they brought people in, and they backed certain individuals as part of this leadership team around recruitment. And of course, Daniel Levy will still be involved, regardless of what's said, regardless of whether he's less hands-on comparative in years gone by. There's always going to be a financial consideration from Levy, and there's always going to be a practical element as well. And I think you want that because he can be a very good, firm and strong negotiator. But Lang is the really important one, very highly rated within the industry. Usually a technical director, we're talking about planning ahead, and a sporting director will have oversight. And then obviously all of your scouts and the people doing the deal will tend to be more now focused. So Tottenham and Lang have been planning, and I think we're going to see the fruits of that labour this summer and hopefully beyond. And the other thing to bear in mind too is that Tottenham have got no significant PSR troubles. They're waiting in the market for the right opportunity, and this recruitment revamp in the last 12 months or so has been about building towards this summer. But if you don't get presented with the right player, the right profile, the right value at the right time, and Euros and Copa America can influence that, they're not just going to move for the sake of moving. And it's funny because sometimes you see what another club does, and immediately fans that want more say, why are we not doing that? How are Chelsea so busy? Manchester United don't have much money, but they're still making bids left, right, and centre. Why are Spurs not doing enough? But there's three junctures that recruitment teams will look at. One is between now and pre-season. There's still time left. One is heading into the first game of the season because you want a settled squad. And obviously, if you're going to buy someone, ideally, you want them eligible for that first game. And then one is when the window shuts. What have you done in the last few weeks? So we're not really even in phase one of the window. And I think the market has been a bit misrepresentative because certain clubs are working towards this 30th of June accounting deadline and doing mutually beneficial business as well in separate or mirrored deals. We've seen it with Chelsea and Aston Villa and Everton. There was some talk that Newcastle would be doing a deal with Everton as well, although that fell through. It was for Calvert-Lewin and Minter. But it means there's this mad scramble. It feels like we're building up to deadline day when it's not. It's the accounting deadline, and the European clubs are not really even going yet, and nor is the Saudi market because they're July onwards. So Tottenham, I think, if people are impatient, need to stick to this plan that isn't formulated now, isn't panicked because there's plenty of time left in the window, is 12 months in the making because that's Lang's job to window plan, and then let it bear its fruits. And whether someone arrives today, tomorrow, the next day, next week, even next month, it doesn't actually make that much difference. But it's really easy to get caught in a media storm where you say, everyone else is doing business, we're not. And guess what? Tottenham have done business. Bergvall is arriving. I know that was done earlier, but he's effectively going to be a now player and feel like a new signing, even though he was previously announced. Werner has returned, and even though Tottenham fans are familiar with him, that's still a deal that they've got done in the early part of the window. So sometimes your club is working very hard and well run and discreet and have a plan, but just because those players haven't worked their way into the media or walk through the door on day one, there becomes a growing sense of frustration because everybody wants the news immediately. And I still think come the end of the window, Spurs are going to have a healthy amount of incomings. I purposely, by the way, say healthy because I know at some point you're going to put me on the spot and I don't want to give the spoiler as to how many I think are coming in right in the very first answer. But I do think across the window, Spurs will stagger their business, do smart, first team orientated business, build a bit of a spine because we're looking at defence, midfield, attack, and wide players. And come the end of the window, I think you'll start to see the fruits of the labour of Lang, of Postecoglou, and the rest of this still relatively new recruitment team.
Yeah, you can tell Ben's done this show before, can't you?
I know what's coming.
Tell Ben has done this show before. Listen, we love having Ben here. Ben, I want to ask you about Andy's first season at the club. Look, as we touched upon, and you've touched upon it on many times on this show, we lost Harry Kane on the eve of the season. Been battled through a high length of an injury and suspension list, and not to mention a number of players that went for international duty at different points of the season. That figure really, in terms of suspensions, injuries, and international absences, often ended up in double figures during the campaign, and yet Spurs did end up finishing fifth. Although, of course, when you look at the overall end of the season, it was 5 losses out of a possible 7. There was highs, there was lows. I just wonder how you reflect, Ben, on Ange Postecoglou's first season at Spurs, and what, in your mind, do you think will be progression next season under his tenureship?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. At the very beginning of the season, if you'd have said Tottenham would finish 5th, then I think Postecoglou would have been delighted by that. And at that point, let's not forget, we thought that 5th place would be good enough for Champions League. And unfortunately, in a game that's always defined by momentum, many fans perhaps will be looking at the end of the season and feel not only were too many games lost, you mentioned the 5 losses in the last 7 games, 4 of them were on the bounce, an absolute hammering away at Newcastle, disappointing defeat in a North London derby, away at Chelsea, who were hit and miss themselves, and then, of course, losing to Liverpool, and goals were being shipped, and the Ange philosophy was being a little bit tested or questioned by maybe some of the players and certainly the fan base. And then the last loss was obviously Manchester City, which I think gave Postecoglou a bit of a wake-up call, because he learned in the build-up what it means to be a Tottenham supporter, the culture, the relationship with Arsenal, and how certain aspects of Spurs are bigger than only just the football. And I think that Postecoglou was shocked when he heard that fans would be supporting Man City, fans would be wearing the Spurs sky blue kit. And it was almost brushed off by Postecoglou before the game. And then he's there on the touchline thinking, yikes, didn't expect this coming. And I was a bit surprised by that, simply because on the one hand, he's managed in Scotland and he's seen a really fierce rivalry between Celtic and Rangers. And then you're not talking about first game of the season or anything. It's the penultimate match. So at that point, he should have realised the culture of the club. But by the same token, I see it from his perspective as well, because if you're a manager, you don't want to do anything other than try and win a game. And the long and short of it is that there was Champions League football still at stake. I know it was a long shot, but Tottenham did their part afterwards. They beat Sheffield United, and you never know. Had they beaten Manchester City, it would have given them an outside chance of finishing in 4th place. So Postecoglou had to look at it in football terms. So I can see it from both sides. But when you add 5 losses in 7 games, and the last loss, which lingers, being that home defeat to Man City, and that sort of cultural shock that came to Postecoglou's system because of the wider dynamic and the Arsenal factor, all of that puts a bit of a different spin on the season. So I think that what Postecoglou did well is the start, clearly, and maybe Tottenham overperformed, and in doing so set the bar too high. I think 8 games in, in fact, but up to the 10th game of the season, they were first in the table. And at that point, you think to yourself, okay, you build a buffer, and then you can almost just win a couple, draw a couple, lose 1 or 2, still make the top 4. And it looked nailed on at that point, even though it was only 10 games into the season. And everything was going well. Son leading the line, the partnership with Maddison. Then Maddison picks up an injury. Then they get a series of other injuries, and suddenly they go off the boil. And I think the most disappointing thing in the whole season is that run of defeats at the end, from April to mid-May, was kind of mirrored as well in November into mid-December, where from memory, they lost to Chelsea in that crazy game that they kind of got praised for because they were playing with 9 men and he stuck to the principles, and they almost, of course, got something from the game. But then that triggered a loss away at Wolves, which was disappointing, a loss at home to Villa. They drew 3-3 at Man City. That wasn't a bad result, but nonetheless, you have an opportunity to go there and win the game. And even though they were able to rescue a point with that late Kulusevski goal, I believe it was, you still feel like if you're really going to make a statement, go and win away at Man City, because that's a momentum builder off the back of those 3 defeats that I mentioned. And then they go after that game, which was encouraging, and they lose at home to West Ham. And you start to think, well, we've gone from being first in the table after 10 games to all the way down to 5th, which is where Tottenham ended up finishing. So overall, my thoughts are there were mitigating circumstances. There were runs of poor results. There were times maybe when Postecoglou needed to back down from his gung-ho tactics. But at the end of the day, 5th is 5th. It's a building block. They were there or thereabouts for Champions League. And with a few shrewd signings and not as many injuries and getting the best out of that relationship between Son and Maddison, it's building blocks. And if you look at Postecoglou, big leap from Conte ball, more than 1 year is probably needed to solidify that style and that philosophy. And therefore, I think from Postecoglou's point of view, and he said this, I believe, on record, he's not looking at positions or points. He's looking at progress. And you don't really know what progress you've made when you've only had 1 season. You only really start to learn about progress when you jump from your first season to your second season. So instead of judging Spurs on last season, I'm more inclined to reserve judgment and say, okay, given all these circumstances, these injuries, these highs, these lows, these goals, these collapses, where are they going to be comparative to that first year with a fitter squad and with a deeper squad? And this is where I think the future is bright, because if you look at Tottenham's finish, 66 points, I think it was 74 goals, but 61 conceded. So the aim next season is try and score 75 to 80 goals again, try and concede 10 less, hope that that gets you 10 more points. Suddenly you're on 75, 76 points. That's progress. That's Champions League football. That's a step forwards. And then you've got to stay there in that top 4. You can't be a yo-yoing in and out type team who takes 1 step forwards, 2 steps back. That's been Spurs in too many seasons. And this is why I think that Postecoglou is being very cautious in how he's defining success and progress, because he'd much rather Tottenham increase the metrics every season. So in 2, 3, 4 years' time, it's always a consistent high number of goals. It's conceding less. It's more and more points. Then get Champions League and everyone celebrate it. And then the following season, take 2 steps backwards. And I agree with him. Progress for Tottenham is about being a consistent Champions League qualifier. And that might take 3 to 5 years. And I hope that Tottenham back Postecoglou, because we saw enough in that first season to suggest that he is the right man for the job. But he maybe just has to be a bit more tactically flexible. So in those big games or those difficult games or in those injury hit games, Tottenham have a plan B, because I like the plan A, the plan Ange, whatever you want to call it. But I was less sure that Tottenham had a plan B in certain games last season.
Yeah, look, I think they're all very, very valid points, Ben. I'll be honest with you, a lot of those points have been definitely echoed and reiterated by a lot of the panellists that come on to Last Word on Spurs week after week, game after game. And look, I mean, it's quite interesting coming over to you, Matt, because Spurs have already, and Ange Postecoglou has already kind of made inroads in terms of changing some of the things behind the closed curtains, and that is, of course, Spurs confirming key changes to Ange Postecoglou's coaching staff ahead of the 24-25 Premier League season. We knew Spurs have been looking for reinforcements to the backroom staff following Chris Davis departing earlier in the month to take up that role at relegated Birmingham City. His place as the senior assistant head coach from Postecoglou now has been taken over by Matty Wells, the former academy player and under-18s boss, who returned to Spurs last year as an assistant, having worked closely with ex-Spurs midfielder Scott Parker, and also during his time at Fulham, Bournemouth, and in Belgium with Club Brugge. In addition to Wells' promotion, Spurs have also confirmed the arrivals of 2 new backroom staff members in Nick Montgomery and Sergio Raimondo, both of whom join Ange Postecoglou as assistants. And we had a fabulous interview we did last night with the wonderful John Grecian, the autobiography writer, author of Ange's book, The Man, the Mastery, which you can check out for more real detailed analysis on Ange. I just wonder for you, Matt, with these 2 additional members coming in, is it important to have these guys coming in because they're real Postecoglou believers in the way this man wants to play? And what did you make of those changes to the backroom staff?
Yeah, look, I think having coaches in there who not just will come in and will believe in Ange's style of play, but have already had that sort of philosophy and that approach to football themselves in their career in the past is going to be incredibly important, because at the end of the day, these are the men that are going to try and get the players to buy into all of this. And if they themselves are already bought into it and can prove that, I think that's a really powerful thing for them to be able to make their mark on the squad. And look, Matt Wells, I think, is a brilliant choice for assistant manager. I think I was taken aback, maybe like some others, that Ryan Mason was overlooked, given the history he has, not only as assistant manager, but also as interim coach at Spurs. But Matt Wells is Tottenham through and through. You know, he was an academy player. He's, of course, the grandson of the legendary Cliff Jones, and has worked at various levels at Tottenham throughout his career before. And one thing that I think he will aid in with Ange Postecoglou is his belief in young players coming through. And there's, you know, we grew a little bit frustrated maybe towards the latter half of last season that some players weren't being given a chance, the likes of Jamie Donnelly, Will Lancashire, and a few more as well, Mikey Moore especially. And Wells, having worked in that youth academy, and again, just having that belief in young players, I think will be crucial. And actually, even when he was doing his coaching badges, he actually worked under Alex Inglethorpe for a bit, who has been at Tottenham in the past. But again, another big believer in integrating youth into first teams. He's now the academy director at Liverpool. So for me, Matt Wells is a fantastic choice. Nick Montgomery, someone I know less about. In my previous job, I did cover the Scottish Premiership, so I watched a little bit of Hibs last season. Wasn't particularly impressed, and I think that's kind of reflected in the fact that he only lasted 8 months there. But I would say Hibs are a little bit like the Watford of Scotland. They've had 9 different men in the dugout in the last 5 years. So I don't think we can look into that in too much depth. But again, someone who has that similar philosophy. He likes playing attacking football. He likes playing possession-based football. He won the league with Central Coast Mariners before he went to Hibs, so he has that success behind him as well. And again, maybe you could give him similar criticisms to what you gave Ange Postecoglou, because he struggled to get started at Central Coast Mariners and never really got started at Hibs. And kind of, I know a lot of Hibs fans describe the way they played as passing it around the box without much happening, which again you could say about Spurs under Postecoglou. Raimundo, I'd be lying if I told you I knew anything about him, but having looked into him, he seems like an impressive man. Can speak 6 languages, and I think that's incredible. So for that fact alone, I'm happy to have Raimundo coming in as well.
You got a feeling on that, Ben, for you, just in terms of the coaching staff changes? Do you think they benefit Spurs, and getting a couple more men in there that clearly obviously believe in the way he'll want to play next season?
Yeah, I think Matt summed it up, so I'll be brief. These are Postecoglou people. Montgomery and Raimundo worked alongside each other for Central Coast Mariners and Hibs, and they'll do likewise, obviously, at Tottenham as well as assistant coaches. And Montgomery knows Postecoglou after a successful time in Australia with the Mariners as well. So this is driven by Postecoglou, who believes that when you move to a bigger club, you still have to replicate the same culture. And it's true what Matt said about Montgomery. He had a very hard time at Hibs, but he was stepping up into a head coach role. Hibs not the easiest club to do that with, because they've got a fantastic, fervent fan base. I know people always talk about the Glasgow teams, Rangers and Celtic, but Hibs and Hearts have also got a lot of fans. They're filling 25,000 each week. And Hibs are, to some extent, not the Watford, even though that is one apt analogy, but they're more like the Spurs of Scottish football in the sense that they're perennial underachievers. And every time Hibs get close to winning something, there's a phrase that's used in Edinburgh by Hearts fans, which is Hibsed it, which is, I suppose, very similar to how Tottenham sometimes get mocked unfairly as Spursy. And Hibs have had many times where they've threatened to succeed and then ended up blowing it. And Montgomery didn't really have any patience or that much backing, financially speaking. It's very different now, because the Hibs team that he was a part of were under the Gordon family. And sadly, the owner, Ron Gordon, had passed away, a delightful human being, brilliant character. I did stuff with Hibs a few years back, and I helped them with one of their activations, which was the Thank You NHS that they wore on the front of their shirt during the pandemic. And Ron and the Gordon family, brilliant people, charismatic, loved the club, but they were managing it during a pandemic from afar. And then when Hibs came out of the pandemic, it was very difficult for them to really get a grip on the finances and the infrastructure, because as a smaller club, they'd lost a lot of staff. And I think some of that has resulted in poor football results and recruitment and ultimately managerial turnover. And Montgomery kind of got the back end of that, whereas now Hibs are owned in 33% wise stake by Bill Foley. So they've got the Black Knights, same as Bournemouth ownership. They've got a lot more backing behind them. And if Montgomery got the job today at Hibs, then it might be slightly different and maybe he would have been able to stay in it for longer. But both of these as assistant coaches are man managers. They've got a good record of developing youth. They give their opinion clearly. They are not afraid to stick to a side or argue a case or play devil's advocate. They have an open door policy and they'll do a lot of the legwork for Postecoglou. So Postecoglou in the media has kind of one personality. It reminds me of Ranieri, even though they've got very different personalities, but he's got one sort of media persona and he's got one behind closed doors. And I remember interviewing Dejan Kulusevski 7 or 8 months ago, and he said the Postecoglou in that dressing room or the training ground is completely different to the Postecoglou that you love because he gives great answers in press conferences. And he's a bit more distant, and not in a bad way, but he purposefully doesn't try and be in touch with the dressing room. So he spends less minutes in there and in and around his players, and he delegates. Montgomery and Raimundo have both got a relationship for really forging those relationships and filling in the gaps when the manager isn't there. And it's not because Postecoglou doesn't want to engage minute by minute by minute, but he wants the weight of his words and instruction and tactical analysis to carry weight. So instead of 24/7 speaking, even though of course that is what you do in live training or matches, he'll go to his office. And it was Montgomery and Raimundo in previous roles that they've done that picked up that kind of interaction with the players, eating lunch with them, informal conversations, basically filtering in knowledge indirectly through all of those opportunistic moments that you get whilst having a game of darts or pool with them, or joining them in the gym, or wandering around casually, or scheduling a little meeting to try and integrate someone into the group. And that's the sort of marginal gains that you don't see. And Raimundo, because he speaks multiple languages, and Montgomery now, because he's been a manager and has an extra string to his bow and will have learnt from what went wrong at Hibs, the combination of those two will definitely help support Postecoglou. And between the three of them, you've got three different approaches, different languages, different personalities, and collectively, I think there'll be a very strong coaching staff to help Tottenham improve. And that will be targeted towards bringing on the players as footballers, but also leaders and personalities.
Love that, Ben. Look, I think, again, when we're looking for change, we're looking to evolve, we're looking to obviously upgrade and improve the football club. You have to believe that those changes are necessary if Spurs are to do so. And called for change during, of course, towards the end of the season. He's got his men there. No one can say at the moment he hasn't been backed in terms of the staff. But what next comes is he's going to be backed in terms of the players. So what lovely to see how that is. What we are going to do, we are going to go for our first break of the show for our listeners on audio. We've got nearly over 2,500 of you that are watching us live. Listen, we're joined by the wonderful Matty Hayes, alongside me, my sidekick, my co-host. I'm joined by the wonderful broadcaster, journalist returning to the airwaves on Last Word On Spurs, the brilliant Ben Jacobs. I know many absolutely adore and love whenever we have Ben on this show, and I think all of us hang on his every word. So, as Ben said it, I'm not taking his words out of his mouth. He said it earlier. It's time to get towards that meat of what we're going to be discussing, because there's lots to discuss on this Last Word On Spurs, and I think the one that I think will be key to kind of open us up in terms of transfers and where we go is relation to what we're looking for, Ben, this summer. Because Spurs, as we understand from the outside looking in, we understand they're looking to prioritise an attacking and midfield area of signings in the weeks ahead. But they're also set to add their defensive numbers as the summer transfer window goes on, particularly with stream of players heading out of the exit door at N17. So it'd be really good to know from you what you understand to be the main targeted areas that Spurs are looking for in this summer transfer window.
Yeah, I've learned my lesson from previous shows to be vague about positions. Don't worry, we'll come on to the specifics a little bit later. There I go again, giving away a bit of a spoiler. But positional wise, I think you summed it up very well. Goals and, very loosely speaking, a Harry Kane type replacement, even though Son can play in a more advanced position. And if Richarlison was to depart and there's interest from Saudi Arabia, then obviously there's even more need to have an out-and-out striker. So goals and perhaps more of a traditional striker that can fulfill some of the qualities that are missing after Harry Kane departed, because there was never a direct replacement for Kane 12 months ago. Central midfield is another one. I think Postecoglou wants a box-to-box midfielder, even a number 8 that can kind of break when circumstances are right into a number 10 type position. And then defensive cover is going to be important. And I think at fullback in particular, the likes of Destiny Udogie and Pedro Porro could do with a little bit more squad support. So those are the areas I think they'll prioritise. Wide type players that are versatile, yes, important as well. But the fact that Timo Werner has extended at least means that they've effectively got another name through the door that they could have lost had Werner not rejoined. Then I think we'd also be talking as high priority as another wide-sided player, whether winger or forward. So Tottenham are going to be busy, and I think those are the main areas that they'll look to strengthen. Everything else could depend on outgoings as well. And if a flurry of players in a set position leave, then they'll obviously have to adapt and maybe add a bit more depth. But what I was always told is that Postecoglou is less of the Pep and more of the Pochettino mold of manager, where he's happy to back himself, even though last season might not be a fair reflection on this, that players will stay fit and do the legwork in the pre-season and trust a slightly smaller squad. Not so insanely small that you're left short, but we're not talking 28, 29, 30. It's more 23 to 25 is what Postecoglou, like Pochettino, thinks is the optimum squad size. Whereas with Pep Guardiola and Jurgen Klopp, they wanted 27, 28, because that extra 3 would see them through seasons where maybe they had a Club World Cup along with the Champions League. And I know that Tottenham, if they fight on all fronts, could still play 65 games, but Postecoglou ideally wants that core squad of 23 to 25 rather than 25 to 28. That's my understanding anyway.
Ben, you mentioned at the start of that answer there, Timo Werner, who of course will remain a Tottenham player for the next 12 months after extending his loan, and Tottenham also have the option to make that deal permanent for about £8.5 million. Do you think Werner has been brought in as a signing for the squad, or can you see him having a really important role to play in this team next season?
I think it depends on Werner, doesn't it? Because you look at him some days and he's a world beater, and you look at him other days and you think, hang on a minute, no wonder Tottenham hesitated about the original option to buy. But what people don't see about Werner, or maybe little parts of it in interviews, is he's a fantastic character. And this is why he's a fit. Because if he's a squad player, he'll be okay with that and he'll work his socks off. If he comes off the bench, he'll make an impact. If he starts games, he'll constantly try and improve. He's at the kind of age where the consistency may never come. That's the truth. And we're judging him very highly because we're not saying inconsistent in terms of can't make it at the top level. But when you're Tottenham and you move, the expectation is that you have to deliver at peak level. And sometimes Werner gives you a 10 out of 10 by Premier League standards, and sometimes he gives you a 2 out of 10 and misses a bunch of chances. So the potential and the attributes that he has at late 20s is one thing, and the numbers are another. And they're certainly not groundbreaking, are they? I think it was 2 Premier League goals and 3 assists, albeit that was only in 10 starts. And really, you want to try and get 1 goal contribution a game to really slot into that position. So with more game time, and as he beds into the system and plays more under Postecoglou, maybe the numbers can improve. But ultimately, from Tottenham's point of view, they feel he's not just the right position with versatility and speed, but also is the right kind of character in that dressing room. So if he does get pushed down the pecking order, he'll still be okay being a squad player. And you know what you get with Timo Werner: lightning pace, gets into dangerous areas, plays off the left wing, creates the odd big chance, puts some of them away, misses a lot of them, but very rarely is his confidence knocked. So he'll always try a shot. And hopefully, therefore, eventually the numbers will reflect the kind of footballer that he can be. And the original signing was driven by Lang, who was aware at the time he first arrived that Tottenham needed far more speed, and also somebody that could flit into areas that pull defenders out of shape and cause damage on the counter-attack as well. And Werner ticks all of those boxes. We know as well that Postecoglou has held Werner in high regard for quite some time. So this is just an example of Lang and Postecoglou working together to find the right fit. but Spurs haven't bought. They've only loaned again with an option. And I think that does still give you an indication that they want to give Werner more time, but there are still some reservations.
Yeah, most certainly. Look, we know that transfer, what I call them, hierarchy are working their way in the background. You know, Spurs, as you touched on, Ben, they conceded 61 goals last season, 32 from open play, 14 from set pieces. Look, the overhaul of Spurs' defence already began earlier in the summer. Eric Dyer departed, as did Japhet Tanganga, Ryan Sessegnon, who got released in those recent weeks in the build-up to the summer. And I think, you know, many have looked at it upon Spurs being utterly ruthless when it comes to not giving older players when they had the option maybe of extending their contracts by a further 12 months. I just want to ask you, Ben, what do you make of the way Spurs did dispose of those players where they could have extended their contracts by 12 months? Is that a good indication that Spurs are acting ruthlessly in the market and are looking to finally, you feel, change the narrative with regards to the way they approach transfer markets in general?
Definitely ruthless in the case of Sessegnon anyway, and now we wait and see where he ends up. I think West Ham is a possibility. I know there's some talk of a return to Fulham. I think that comes more from Fulham fans that would like him back. I felt a bit sorry for Sessegnon because he's only 24, joined in 2019 and has had a number of injury problems. So unfortunately, Tottenham never saw the best. And it's probably a combination of the fact that he's approaching mid-20s. Tottenham feel that they've got depth or are going to add depth. And then in addition to that, they need players that they can trust are going to stay consistently fit. And unfortunately for Sessegnon, he had that surgery on his right hamstring in, I think it was February, made only about 60 odd appearances in 5 or 6 years, never really got going. And I can understand why they let him go. With Tanganga, similar situation, really, mid-20s, came through the Spurs Academy and made something in the region of 50 or 60 appearances. Those of you that are listening will have the numbers, but I think it would be within that ballpark. We know that there was that loan to Augsburg in Germany as well, and Millwall too. And Millwall would certainly like to have a conversation with him to try and get that one over the line permanently. But Tottenham have to decide whether or not they're prepared to keep these players on the books for depth, if deep down they don't think they're going to stay fit enough or be good enough. And in both of those cases, I do think that it was Lang and Postecoglou driven rather than on the player side. I think Eric Dyer was a little bit different. Spurs would have ideally liked to keep him for the experience and the depth, but Bayern came calling. It was a move abroad. Harry Kane was there, was able to play Agent Kane to some extent and tell him that Bayern was the place to be. And ultimately, when you're in that kind of situation, you also have to respect the player's position. And I think with Dyer, deal that suited all parties. But if Bayern hadn't come calling, I don't think Tottenham would have been desperate to force him out the door. Whereas with Sessegnon and Tanganga, I think that the players were waiting to see what Spurs wanted to do. And it was clear when they had that conversation with Postecoglou and his wider team that there was no future for them at the football club.
I think it's quite funny to hear you say that Kane played the agent role in that Eric Dyer move, because it makes me realise that Charlie Kane isn't even the most successful agent in the family, but I digress. A few more players, Ben, who could be moving on from Spurs this summer: Sergio Reguilón, Jed Spence and Joe Rodon. They all had successful loan spells last year at Brentford, Genoa and Leeds, respectively. Are these three exits that you think Tottenham could look to get done quickly this summer?
Yeah, it's possible. I think that Jed Spence has hit a few hurdles. There was an option to buy in the Genoa deal. And I did an exclusive interview maybe 2 months ago with Marco Ottolini, the sporting director at Genoa, and the CEO, Andres Blanquez. And both of them said that they like Jed, even though they appreciate that he's still a bit inconsistent, but they would have to negotiate with Tottenham at a lower number. And I don't think that Genoa are really looking to spend more than 2 or 3 million on Spence, and Tottenham would want at least double that. So let's wait and see whether anything progresses. The door's not totally shut, but it's been a few weeks now of direct talks between Spurs and Genoa. And at the time we're recording, I'm not aware of any deal being agreed, and that would be for a permanent move. I know that Leeds United, where Spence would go, have had a look, and there might be a possibility there, but I still sense that in that case, it would likely needed Leeds to get promoted to the Premier League. He was, of course, on loan there in 2023, 2024 before Genoa. So there is that connection, but Leeds are looking at outgoings. They've not got the kind of money to bring on board any kind of signings, even to the tune of 4 or 5 million. So I'm not aware that Leeds have made a fresh approach, but I am aware that they would have come in for Spence if they'd have got promoted to the Premier League. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Ipswich had discussed as well in the last few weeks of the Championship season, but have turned their attention to other targets now. So we wait and see if anything develops. With Rodon, you have Leeds as well. Again, a connection. They would like to sign the player permanently. That's still not off the table. And Leicester are very keen as well, my club. So we keep an eye on that one. With Reguilón, it feels a bit quiet at this stage. I'm not aware of anything advanced. I know that from Tottenham's point of view, they would like that one resolved. And I feel a bit sorry for Reguilón, really, because he's had to go out on a couple of loans and we've not really seen anybody bite. First, of course, in 2022-23, it was Atleti. And then there was that brief spell at Manchester United, and it was off the back of Manchester United wanting Marc Cucurella first, and that fell through. And then they turned to Reguilón, but there was always a break clause, and he only played 8 or 9 games for Manchester United, and off he went to Brentford, and again played 10 or 15 games. So he's constantly been involved. He's not been short of minutes, but his actual Tottenham game time has not been substantial at all since the 25 odd games he played in 2021-22. So for whatever reason, they've decided, even though he's been playing at a high level in these loans, that they don't see him as part of their first team plans. So I would expect other offers to come in for him. There's some interest in Italy and from Turkey as well. But at the time we're recording, I'm aware more of advanced talks between Tottenham and clubs for Rodon and Spence than I am for Reguilón.
Thanks so much for that, Ben. Look, there has been a few rumours earlier in the window, should I say, before it opened, that there was links between Romero and Real Madrid. Look, it's actually now Postecoglou having a real strong trio to his hands of Romero, Mickey van der Ven and Dragusin. Now, it's so typical that you'd get this kind of rumour start. I mean, look, it's been predominantly, we've seen, a couple, I'd say, of media outlets in Argentina link the player to Real Madrid. I'd be good to understand your situation and whether you can give us some confidence as far as you're concerned that Romero will remain a Spurs player this summer. Where are you in regards to that possibility at the moment?
Well, I've got full respect, obviously, for anybody else's reporting, so I'm not here to shout that down, but it's quite difficult when your information is different. So I give full respect to anyone saying Real Madrid want to sign Romero. It's just not my understanding. Tottenham don't want to lose Romero either, and that's the more important point. So barring some insane astronomical bid, there's very little chance that he's going to go anywhere. And remember, he joins in 2021 for just over 40 million. So an astronomical bid would be up there with what Everton are valuing Jared Branthwaite, with what Harry Maguire went to Manchester United for from Leicester, which is 80 million. It would pretty much be a British transfer record for a defender if Tottenham were even to consider it. And even then, they might say no. So I'm not actually aware that Real Madrid are planning anything. And they've already spent big money on Kylian Mbappe, and their top defensive priority is Lille's Lenny Yoro, who they're advancing on. And they're either going to persuade Yoro, if they can't agree a fee with Lille, to wait and then join them on a free transfer in 2025, or they're going to put down something in the region of 40 million euros and hope that's enough, even though Lille want between 50 and 60 million euros. So even though we hear Liverpool and Manchester United for Lenny Yoro, the feeling is that he's most likely to go to Real Madrid. And again, that's more money, and that is another defender. So I don't personally hear from sources any substance from the Real side to suggest they're going to bid, or more importantly, any substance from the Spurs side to suggest that they might accept an offer.
I think the Lenny Yoro, wherever he ends up, is going to be an exciting sort of domino effect from this window with so many clubs interested. It'll be interesting to see where he ends up. At fullback, Ben, AC Milan are reportedly looking to take Emerson Royal to Italy. The Brazilian appeared in 24 matches in Postecoglou's first season in charge, showing his versatility with a number of his starts coming at centre-back, but he doesn't naturally fit the Australian system as a fullback. How quickly do you think we will see his departure this summer?
Yeah, it depends on Milan. Remember, their priority is to bring in a striker, and it looks like they're in a very competitive race now with Manchester United for Joshua Zirkzee, and that's their budget at this stage. But Milan are also actively working, so this isn't just speculation. There's been concrete talks to try and make that deal happen. And it's either going to be Emerson, who's one option, or potentially Thiago Santos, and Milan are competing with Juventus for his signature. So I expect them to strengthen in that position, and Emerson is still within their thoughts. And I would also keep an eye on Saudi and Al Nassr, who are considering making an approach. And we might come on to this a bit later. He's not the only Tottenham player, Emerson, that may draw interest from Saudi Arabia. And it may be a way of Daniel Levy doing some kind of, I'm going to call it bulk business, even though they'd all be separate deals. But sometimes people on the Saudi side go to the player, like with Jordan Henderson when he left for Al Ittifaq, and the club are there just waiting, and they haven't got an offer. And they read in the media that some astronomical wage is on the table, and they think, no one's even called us yet. And other times, like with Chelsea when they sold Edouard Mendy and Kalidou Koulibaly to Saudi Arabia, the deal makers knock on the front door and they sit down and they say, who do you want to sell? And someone like Daniel Levy says, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And Saudi say, okay, we'll take 4 of them. What kind of deal can you do for us? And then they'll all be separate deals and allocated to different clubs. So keep an eye on Emerson and Al Nassr if Milan falls through. And I think it will be a surprise if we get to the end of the window and Emerson is still a Spurs player.
That sounded like a high run-up special there, Ben. That really, truly did, I've got to say. Look, Spurs have been reportedly scouting a number of different defenders, which I'm sure you'll be familiar of. We've had Nottingham Forest, Murillo, but we've got, my apologies, we've got Bologna's Ricardo Calafiori, we've got Feyenoord, Lasharel Gatrida, and Crystal Palace's Mark Gahey, along with Bayer Leverkusen's Pio Hinchapi, Chelsea's Trevor Chalobah, and Wolves' Max Kilman. And from your understanding, is any of those genuine targets this summer?
Yeah, I'll tell you about a few of them that I know. So with Calafiori, I think that this one has legs. Tottenham have been keeping an eye on the player pretty much since January as well. Bologna are going to expect a fee of around 50 million euros. And again, if they sell Joshua Zirkzee, they might be a little bit more difficult with Calafiori. The good news for Spurs is that despite constant links, I'm told that Liverpool are not in the race, but Juventus are the other club that are pushing. With Murillo, there's a very realistic possibility that he could go somewhere. Chelsea are the latest club to inquire, and they might try and fob off Trevor Chalobah going the other way. I'm surprised actually that Tottenham are not in the conversation for Chalobah, especially as if we come on to later, there's some kind of debate to be had over price regarding Conor Gallagher. But at the moment, I'm not aware of anything between Spurs and Trevor Chalobah. But with Murillo, I think it could be more Chelsea than Tottenham that enter that race. Gay's been a long-standing target, and so is Max Kilman. In fact, Kilman was a story I think that I broke in terms of the links to Spurs 12 months ago on this very show, and now he's on the radar. The challenge with Kilman is that Wolves are looking for something in the region of 45 million. West Ham have had an offer rejected at 25 million. Napoli have had an offer rejected at 30 million. And it's going to have to go significantly north of both of those offers to persuade Wolves to sell. And that doesn't quite, to me, feel like a Daniel Levy deal. And this is what I mean about coming back to what we said before, where it's a new recruitment team. Postecoglou's got a lot of say. Lang is calling the shots until you get to the point where you have to decide how much money you're going to spend. And then Daniel Levy is, as you would expect, still very integral. And in light of that, I'm not so sure that Kilman will be the one that Tottenham go for. West Ham are the big favourites there because Julian Lopetegui is in charge. But there is a possibility that Newcastle or even Manchester United enter the race. With Pierre Hincapié, the player wants to come to the Premier League. And again, similar good news for Tottenham that the interest from Liverpool is mostly just speculation and is heavily downplayed by the sources that I speak to in the Liverpool camp. I'm not aware that Tottenham have advanced on that one yet. It's likely to take in excess of £35 million. And even though Hincapié didn't play week in, week out for Leverkusen, they still like to keep hold of him. I did a interview that you can see on my feed at SoccerX with Fernando Caro, the CEO of Leverkusen, and he said that we're keeping Alonso. We only want to lose one. And I think the one that they'll lose is Jeremy Frimpong, which makes it very difficult for anyone to prize 𝐴𝐻𝐾𝐰 away. So let's kind of see how things materialize now. But Calafiore is probably the most concrete of those names as far as I'm told. And I think that will probably excite Tottenham fans because of that bunch. If you discount proven Premier League quality, that's probably the most in-demand profile with the right kind of attributes that could be a good addition to the squad. So let's see whether or not they meet the asking price.
Ben, I want to throw a few fullback names at you as Tottenham look to potentially replace Emerson Royal, but also bring in some much-needed backup for Pedro Porro. Vanderson of AS Monaco, I think, is a name that's kind of refusing to go away. We also have Jan Couto, part of that Girona team that had nearly a very special season in La Liga last year, plus Michael Coyote and Giovanni Leone. Are any of these genuine targets for Spurs this summer?
I think Couto isn't, and it's depth that's needed, right? So we're not talking about replacing Pedro Porro. It has to be somebody that can coexist with Pedro Porro. And Couto, for me, doesn't fall into that category. Vanderson is someone that's been discussed internally. Leone has a lot of interest, and I'm not actually so sure that his preference is to go to the Premier League. So maybe some convincing would be necessary there. But Tottenham are definitely going to move in this direction and early in the window, because as we said right at the beginning of the show, it's about fullback cover or depth. And if they can get that, then it eases the burden, obviously, on Porro, but they have to find the right kind of character that will fit comfortably within the squad, rather than somebody that's going to come in and instantaneously demand first team football. And it's a balance, because you want to promise pathways, obviously, to footballers. And yet at the same time, you have to appreciate that the two fullbacks that we've mentioned, Porro and Udogie, are still hugely important to Tottenham. And I don't see anybody ousting Udogie unless he's injured, because he's the right profile, the right age, getting better and better and better. With Porro, the delivery's still there. The importance to the team in terms of goals and leadership and getting forwards is also equally something that I think is valued. So we're kind of going to have to understand the type of profile that Tottenham are looking for, and maybe be a bit surprised by it as well, because what we've seen with dating back to Vicario and one or two others is that Postecoglou, with his input, backed by Lang, are not afraid to go unproven. They're not afraid to surprise us. They're not afraid to buy young. And it means that the kind of target that they go for will be one with promise, one with profile that has a staggered age gap between some of these names. So they might buy a 19 to 21-year-old so they can bed in. And then in addition to that, Tottenham don't like to mess around once they decide who the target is. So Postecoglou will be saying to his recruitment team, you investigate all these names, but if you get into a bidding war or a roadblock, let's just move on and go to the next target, because he wants things done swiftly. So it might not feel like Tottenham are moving that fast at the moment, but when they finally lock in on a target, it will be quite a quick negotiation, I sense, because we're not in the era of like Daniel Levy kicking his feet and making things summer sagas, whether it's a player staying or coming in. We're much more of the belief now within Tottenham's hierarchy that they may take their time in deciding, but once they've decided, if they don't think something is possible, they'll move away onto the next kind of profile. So let's kind of wait and see how things develop. I don't know also, when you kind of talk about Giovanni Leone, just to like add a side point, if we're really forming him in that kind of fullback area, because he can play in a back three on the right side, but as far as I'm aware and what I've seen, he's more centre-back. So right-sided centre-back in a back three potentially, or just a straight centre-back, and definitely not quite in the Porro mould. And he's spent the 2024 season, I believe, on loan at Sampdoria, and barely played for Padova either, and is still only 17 years of age. So if they went down that route with that kind of player, and I'm not aware of anything advanced at this stage, then you'd really be buying a promising teenager for the future anyway, and he probably wouldn't get any squad time for the next few seasons.
It's fascinating stuff. It really is, Ben. Thank you so much for that update. Now, I mean, look, turning our attention to the midfield area of Spurs, Pierre-Emile Højbjerg earlier in the window was linked with a potential reunion to join Antonio Conte, of course, in Serie A. We understand that Højbjerg's agent insists he can't be part of a big club with great ambition, amid rumours, of course, of a move away from Spurs. He did change representatives, as we know, over the course of the last few months. In terms of players looking to leave the club, the same goes for 𝐿𝐵𝐼 Lo Celso. We understand he's looking for a fresh new challenge this summer, as there are links to Real Betis, along with a proposed offer which Spurs included him in as a make-weight for Jacob Ramsey, who we're going to ask you about shortly. We also understand that Bryan Gil is expected to depart the football club this summer, although we have been saying that for the last couple of windows. So just on those three I mentioned there, Højbjerg, Lo Celso, Bryan Gil, how quickly do you think we'll see all three of these players depart this summer?
Yeah, with Højbjerg, you summed it up very nicely. And all I've really got to add is that the expectation is that he'll leave. He made 40-odd appearances last season, but I can only think of started games on one hand or two hands maximum. It wasn't many, was it, of those 36 games that he actually started. And with the contract expiring in 2025, there will be an opportunity for Tottenham to get a fee, and they'll take that. And I don't think it will be as tough a negotiation as 12 months ago when Atletico Madrid were in the frame. I think that Italy is a more likely destination now. I'm not aware of Atleti rekindling their interest, although they did consider Conor Gallagher, for example, who was too expensive, a slightly different kind of midfielder to Højbjerg, but it shows you that they're trying to strengthen in the centre of the park. So let's wait and see whether we get a twist and Atleti return. But I'd be reasonably sure at this stage that Tottenham are just waiting for the Euros to finish, hoping that the value and the exposure raises as he does well at the tournament, and they stay in there for another game, go and knock out Germany, have a big performance, and then suddenly the value raises a bit more, and then they'll find a taker once the Euros finishes. And I do think that Italy is probably the most likely destination. Milan, for example, have been considering Højbjerg and also Mats Weifer as well, whereas Atleti, to my knowledge, has gone cold. I know that Newcastle were thinking about the player as well, but he would likely have to take a wage cut. So I'm not so sure that that one is necessarily going to happen. With Lo Celso, it was interesting, wasn't it? Because I can confirm reports. I think it might have been Fabrizio Romano first, but my apologies if I've accidentally not credited the right colleague. But somebody broke the news that Aston Villa rejected a player plus cash bid from Tottenham for Jacob Ramsey, and it was a 20 million cash deal with Giovanni Lo Celso going the other way. And I'm not surprised that it was turned down, because ultimately Aston Villa don't want to sell Ramsey. It's as simple as that. To answer another question that was probably coming later in the show, he's still seen as fully part of Unai Emery's squad, but that just tells you that Spurs are already working to try and get Lo Celso out in some capacity. There is some interest from Saudi Arabia and also Galatasaray. But 6 months ago, when the Saudis approached Lo Celso and basically said, "Do you want to go?" he said no. And I'm not convinced that anything has changed at this point. And I think with Galatasaray, Turkey's not somewhere that he wants to go either. And then we got to wait, of course, and see what happens with Betis as well. And I think that one is probably still the most realistic possibility that he's got on the table. So there's enough suitors there that I would expect it to get done. But it's interesting that Tottenham are not just trying to sell Lo Celso to, say, Betis. They're saying, hang on a minute, maybe he's got enough leverage that we can define the club rather than waiting for an offer for the player. We can go out in the market and we can try and find who we want and then use it in some kind of swap deal or mirror deal or separate deal, whatever way you want to look at it. So just keep an eye on that situation, because Tottenham may be delaying on Lo Celso to see whether they can use him as leverage. And then with Gil, it's an interesting one, really, because although Feyenoord are one to watch, I was always told for months and months and months, and I'm not even convinced that that much has changed, that he likes it at Spurs and wants to fight for his place and is hoping that pre-season changes Postecoglou's mind. I think Postecoglou may have already made up his mind, and Feyenoord is one to watch. Brighton had some interest, but have now moved on to other targets. So I don't think they'll be coming back for Gil. So of the three, he's probably got the least options at the moment, but he's maybe secretly quite pleased about that, because if he ends up back in pre-season and can change Postecoglou's mind, even though maybe the die is cast, I don't think he's against trying to break into this Tottenham team.
I mean, look, the facilities are great at Spurs, but come on, Matty, help me here.
I think we just have to admire his confidence in his own ability, because he's not shown it, but I'm glad that he thinks it exists in there somewhere. Ben, two players who look likely to remain at Tottenham are Yves Bissouma and Rodrigo Bentancur. Postecoglou reportedly wants to keep them at the club, unsurprisingly, and it would likely take a massive offer to tempt Tottenham to sell either of them. There was actually some links in the Turkish media today between Bentancur and Galatasaray. Not too sure how legit those are, though. Are you expecting both of these players to stay at Tottenham this summer?
Yeah, I think that the expectation for both of those is just that they'll stay. And even though I like to give you as much detail as I can, I think that particular question has a very simple answer. We know that midfield has been a bit of an issue for Postecoglou, and we did see a lot of rotation last season. And I think the thing about Bissouma is that he was either brilliant and a world beater or really struggled. And he made a positive start where we were all talking about how Postecoglou got the best out of him. And then maybe by the end of the season, some Spurs fans listening will feel that there's another route to go as far as a number 6 is concerned. But at the moment, I don't think that Tottenham are looking to sell Bissouma. And I think it's exactly the same with Rodrigo Bentancur as well. At the moment, he's just purely focused on the Copa America. There was a really unfortunate issue where, of course, he made a horrible racial slur against Son. Luckily, they've spoken and the air's been cleared and he's apologized. So that's not really going to impact his summer or future at Tottenham. But I'm glad that the club took swift action there, because it's really easy to normalize these things and say, I didn't mean it, it was just a quip. And I'm glad that Son was able to stand up and get the apology, and it's not going to cause any bad blood in the dressing room. And nonetheless, as much as these things can at times have a detrimental impact on the dressing room, I am told that Son was very understanding, and that the players before that incident and after it maintain a very strong relationship. So that's good news at least, but we definitely don't want to see those kind of things happen. I think that the only club I'd heard were looking for Bentancur was Galatasaray. And at the moment, there's not much in those links. And if there was to be a scenario where Bentancur went, perhaps somebody like David Fratesi could come onto the radar, and maybe that changes the situation a little bit. And there is a genuine interest in that player. But at the moment, they're planning with Bentancur and Bissouma for next season, and it would be quite difficult, I think, for one of those outgoings to happen in the next couple of weeks or even months, simply because, first of all, Tottenham would have to find a player to come in, and second of all, a suitor would still have to meet Tottenham's valuation, which I'm told for both is relatively high.
I missed the days of Last Word on Spurs where we didn't have to ask you about this player, Ben, but on the topic of midfield, I think it would be remiss of us to avoid it. Is there anything new, any update on Conor Gallagher?
Yeah, I feel like we've been talking about Conor Gallagher for about a decade, and he's still young, and it hasn't been that long, I promise. But to cover old ground, I suppose the Tottenham situation is still the same. They haven't moved yet, and they are expected to move. And I would be staggered. Maybe that's a bit strong. Surprised, but I've said that word too many times. I need like a thesaurus to come up with a better word. It would raise eyebrows. There we go. That's a better way of putting it. If Tottenham don't make a formal bid for Conor Gallagher. Aston Villa were the one that held formative talks with Chelsea, and the valuation of Chelsea was far too high. So unless Chelsea take another Villa player like John Duran, and then Gallagher goes the other way, I don't think Villa will move on Conor Gallagher because I'm not so sure that they've got the financial ability. We'll learn a lot more also after the 30th of June, when obviously clubs are satisfied with PSR and then work out what they want to gamble in this window that they might have to recoup in 12 months' time in the early part of the summer 2025 window. So there is a logic that maybe Villa drop down a bigger number because they're in a new financial year, they've got Champions League, but it's still a stretch for them and they haven't yet made a formal bid. And they've been in so many talks with Chelsea over Ian Matson, who's passed his medical to join Villa, and with 𝐅𝐸 𝐂𝐨𝐿 coming the other way, and still no bid for Gallagher. So I think at the moment, Villa are pretty much out the race. And Atletico Madrid were the other club that inquired, and they made an informal offer of about 20 million, and it was roundly dismissed. So that really only leaves Spurs at the moment. Maybe Newcastle United if Bruno Guimaraes is to be sold, but his release clause has expired. And Tottenham's interest first came a year ago when they went to Chelsea with what I'm told was a verbal offer of somewhere close to 35 million, and nothing proceeded. And that was as high as Tottenham were prepared to go. Flash forwards, and they didn't make a bid, contrary to some reports in Italy in January. And then this summer, Gallagher's only got a year left on his contract. And there's nothing to suggest yet that Gallagher will get a new deal. Maybe if the window shuts, Chelsea will have to protect their position and the value, and he might get rewarded. But Chelsea are looking at midfielders left, right, and centre. And Enzo Maresca plays a 4-3-3. And Moises Caicedo, Enzo Fernandez will take two of those spots. And Cole Palmer might be the third one because he's better centrally than wide right. And then you've still got Chukwuemeka, Casadei, Ukwachukwu, Gallagher. And even though he may go to Brighton, a possibility of Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall as well. So add all of that up and the writing might be on the wall for Conor Gallagher at Chelsea. So Tottenham may try and use that, plus the fact they know that Chelsea want sales for 2024, 2025, not this financial year, the next financial year is my understanding. That's where Chelsea are panicking a little bit. And also within UEFA's financial fair play, where the deadline is the 31st of December rather than the 30th of June. So Chelsea are looking at the whole window to bring in money. And as time ticks away and Gallagher maybe returns from the Euros and becomes a bit more unsettled, I sense that Tottenham are waiting to pounce at the right time. And sometimes it's better to come in a bit later when you know the players are back. They're starting to ask who's playing. They want to make up their mind. The Euros is over. The timing is so important if you're to be opportunistic. And I would expect Tottenham to come in around 35 million again. I'd be really surprised if they just meet Chelsea's valuation. It's not a Daniel Levy type of deal. Chelsea want in excess of 50 million. They point to Mason Mount's move to Manchester United 12 months ago. And they say, well, Mount's a similar age. Mount's also a top talent. Mount also had a year left on his contract. And Chelsea say, we got 55 million all in, 50 million guaranteed, 5 million in add-ons. Gallagher should be exactly the same, most notably because he's even better form-wise than Mount was when he was sold. And they'll argue that till they're blue in the face. And Daniel Levy will sit there, will listen, and then we'll still offer 15 million less, because there's no way that Tottenham are dropping 55 million and then Chelsea are going to be in a position where they either have to risk losing Gallagher on a free or they have to come down in price. And I think somewhere between 35 and 55 is the actual number that parties may compromise on. So let's see, one, if Spurs formally bid, and I think they will. Two, when they bid, and I think timing is everything. And then three, how low they start, which is an indication of how hardball Daniel Levy and the Tottenham recruitment team prepared to be. And at the end of the day, if they're the only suitor, because Atleti are not in the race, Newcastle have still got Bruno Guimaraes, and Aston Villa can't afford Gallagher, then it is going to put Tottenham in a very strong position.
Look, it's always exciting stuff here. Always really genuinely is. Ben, I want to ask you about a couple of other midfielders that Spurs have been linked with during this summer transfer window so far. Spurs, I believe, you're taking a look at Archie Gray, who is also, again, reported of interest to a number of Premier League clubs. Spurs also reportedly hold an interest in Ederson. There's been links to Carlos Alcaraz, Federico Chiesa. I want to know from you, are those genuine midfield links? And have you heard of any other potential names we should be keeping our eyes on?
Yeah, with Chiesa, there is a realistic chance that he leaves Juventus this summer because he's in the final year of his contract. I still think that Roma or Napoli are the most likely destinations. I've heard that Al Ahly, also in Saudi Arabia, can't be discounted. And Chiesa's agent has been taking meetings, including in London, but everything's very formative at this stage. So I wouldn't want to overblow any links with Tottenham at this point. An exit isn't guaranteed, but one will be sanctioned if an offer comes in over 25 million. And that's pretty good value for a player of his quality. We've heard some historical links with Newcastle as well. I'm not so sure that they're in the race at this stage. With Alcaraz, we know that there is a broad valuation of 30 million, something in that kind of ballpark. And there's been some suggestions that Rodon might be part of that deal. Juventus had him on loan with an option to buy at around 50 million euros, and they haven't taken it. They're still interested in the player. They just don't want to pay that price. So, like I said before, valued at 30 million, which is 40 million euros, and yet the buy clause was 50 million euros. So Juventus are well within their rights to say, we should be paying less or we'll walk away. And if they walk away, it might end up opening the door from Tottenham's perspective. With Ederson and Spurs, I'm told that's more a January thing. I'm not so sure that they've picked up a lot of interest. I would also add Fluminense's Andre into the mix as well. Fulham basically have a verbal agreement, but if João Paulinho doesn't leave, they won't proceed. And they nearly signed him in January, but Paulinho stayed. And now flash forwards to the summer, Fulham are in the box seat still, but until Paulinho's done, the door's open to other suitors as well. And I know that Tottenham have been looking at that player, including at the Club World Cup, for several months. And the most interesting one is Gray, for sure. He's got so many suitors. It reminds me a little bit, actually, of Alex Scott, who Tottenham really wanted. And unfortunately for Spurs, he ended up at Bournemouth. But Tottenham were serious suitors. And Gray played, I think, 40 plus games for Leeds last season. And I would say from the Premier League, Spurs, Chelsea, Liverpool are the three biggest suitors. And the player is very grounded. The whole Gray family, really great people. They don't want to rush the career. So this isn't going to be about who can pay the most wages. This is going to be about the pathway pitch. And it may well be at the end of all of these suitors, the player just says, it's better that I stay at Leeds, do another year, try and get promoted, and then consider making a move. So this might be 2024 because of the volume of interest, but it might also be 2025. And I think Liverpool are slight favourites at this stage because they've got the best relationship with the player camp. But I certainly wouldn't rule out Spurs. And the last point on Leeds that I would mention is people say, oh, Leeds need to sell. So Somerville's going, Gnonto's going, Gray's going, they need 100 million. That's not quite my understanding. And it's contrary, I know, to some reports. And again, I always say this, I respect others, so I'm not shutting down anybody's reporting. But my understanding is that Leeds need between 60 and 70 million. And the 100 million number is inflated because it's not factoring in that on their next financial books, even though they didn't get promoted to the Premier League, they've got the sales of Tyler Adams and Luis Sinisterra to Bournemouth. So if Crescencio Somerville goes, and that's highly likely, that's 35 to 40 million. It means they only need to bring in 20 million. And that may come from Willy Gnonto, which then means that they won't have to sell Archie Gray. And even if they want to sell Archie Gray, Gray's not just going to go because they want him out, because they need him out. Gray's going to only go if the pathway is there. So it's going to be really important if Tottenham want to succeed in this, that one, they potentially play the long game, and two, that they're very hands-on, because this is a sort of Bellingham type player in the sense that he's humble. He listens to his parents. He doesn't want to go that far from home. He doesn't want to move abroad. He doesn't want to rush. He's not impatient to be playing Premier League football or earning 70 to 100k a week. What he wants to do is just focus on his football, stay grounded, develop as a character and a footballer, mature, have the right people around him. And when the time is right, a big move will come. And it still remains to be seen whether it's this summer. I'm not saying categorically he won't go, because when there's this level of interest, someone will make a bid. But what I would say is that I will be not shocked in the slightest if we get to the first game of the season and he's still there, and the end of the window and he's still there, and the end of next season and he's still there, because he's just that kind of character that will wait and back himself to get a move in a year or two, even if there's a concrete move on the table now.
I think it's very fitting, Ben, that you're speaking there about the people around Archie Gray and how grounded he is, because the next player we want to talk about is definitely someone who fits that category as well, with Lucas Beiraval. Not only his family, his parents who have a sporting background, but the brilliant coaches and people that were around him at Bromma Poikarna, where he came through the academy, and now at UR as well in the capital of Sweden. And he's due to join up with Tottenham from the 1st of July, when he will officially become a Spurs player. He's made quite a name for himself in his homeland of Sweden, playing phenomenally in the Allsvenskan. And he's been tipped to become a star in the Premier League as well. Do you think we will see him feature heavily in pre-season for Spurs, and could he be an important missing link for Postecoglou's side?
Yeah, I think so. It wouldn't surprise me if he's thrown straight into the deep end of phenomenal talent, and a real coup, by the way, when Spurs got him, because he was due to go to Barcelona and they were very much billed as the favourites. And we were joking before about Gil and facilities, but that was actually a very big part of it, believe it or not. And the story from sources that I've heard is that as a very considered player, he went on a visit to both clubs, and he picked Spurs first and Barcelona second to tour the facilities, to meet the manager, and all of these other things that you do when you're still deciding. And it was a bit like a university open day, where you look at everything from the training facilities to the digs, to the quality of food, to the players around you, to the pitches, and so on. And you get a vibe for everything. And the city as well. He wanted to ultimately know where he'd live, what the lifestyle would be like, how far would his house be from the training centre. All of these quite scientific, meticulous questions that we probably do associate more with a young kid picking a university than a young footballer picking a club. But crucially, Barca was the second of those two tours, because he felt like he'd go to England kind of knowing that Barca would be too good to turn down. And then he'd be in Barca and he'd sign. And he went to Barca and then had to come back to Spurs to sign. So Spurs basically clinched it with that in-person meeting and tour. And he was blown away by the facilities. And he also held a direct conversation with Dejan Kulusevski as well. So we said Agent Kane for Dyer to Bayern, but it was Agent Kulusevski as far as helping get Bergvall to Spurs. And at the moment, I'm not aware of any loan plans. I think that this is very much a player that will be assessed in pre-season, and if everything goes according to plan, then he'll be a first-team squad member heading into next season.
Do you mind if I just ask you, Ben, very quickly, a question come in here, and it's just on the nature of some of the younger players and academy players here. Spurs diehards asked the question, do you think, we'll ask Ben this, do you think Ben will see much game time given to some of the academy players? We know we've got some tremendous players coming through at Spurs. Obviously, Bergvall's a young talent that will probably end up becoming maybe involved in those pre-season games. We've got likes of Mikey Moore, we've got Tyrese Hall, we've got Jamie Donnelly, of course, a player that I know many have got exciting feelings about. What's your feeling about the youth coming through at Spurs? And I think, again, we touched upon earlier the acquisition of both of those coaches that Ange has brought in Raymondo and Montgomery. I believe two men actually are very much championing of the youth players and youth prospects. Do you think we will see more youth players given the opportunity by Ange this season?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Postecoglou doesn't really look at age. He just looks at development. So if the player warrants through a pre-season where they'll get more minutes naturally than in a competitive game, the inclusion, then Postecoglou will bump them up into the first team. And I come back to what I said before. Why does he want 23 to 25, not 25 to 28 in terms of squad size? Because it gives you that ability to bring up two or three and give them that match day experience. And I would expect that to happen with Jamie Donnelly in particular. Most of you listening will know far more about Spurs' under 23s or under 21s than I do. So I'm not going to patronize you by running through a bunch of names that you've probably got far more knowledge on than I do. But I know for a fact that Donnelly at 19 now is expected to get more game time and have opportunities within the first team squad. And he has pressure on him because some are comparing him to Harry Kane. But in essence, you got to take Kane away and look at him more as a left-footed number 9 who is tenacious, but also can drop off the ball. And he's pretty deft with his feet too. And he's been at Tottenham, I think, since 2012 or 2013. So everyone loves it when an academy product comes through. And I think that if he can get a bit of game time in pre-season, then he stands a real opportunity of making an impact. I believe that he made 3 appearances last season, or certainly a handful. And the fact that he was thrown on for a debut against Manchester City, of all teams, at the Etihad Stadium, shows you the kind of confidence that Tottenham have got in him. So, yeah, I think the short answer is that Postecoglou's not afraid to play youth. I can't, unfortunately, give you an encyclopedic rundown of every single up-and-coming youth player at Tottenham, but that's the beauty of having facilities, being in a great part of London, all the things fans don't see. They help you get the best young talent, because when you're 8 years old, 12 years old, 16 years old, you're there with your parents. You're not only looking at it in football terms, you're saying, how easy is it to drive up there as a parent and drop my kid off? What's the accommodation like if I'm staying overnight on site? How much integration am I going to get with the first team? What's the food like? What's the culture like? What's the environment like? You know something, with young players, the most commonly asked question, believe it or not, because so many don't make it, is exactly that. What will happen if my son or daughter doesn't make it? Because at many clubs historically, it's been, sorry, you've not made it, goodbye. And now the top clubs have got post, in inverted commas, failure or transition managers, that in the same way a loan manager will look at your pathways and monitor you and keep in touch with you, and then you get brought back to the club, there's specialists now that work on, what do we do with a player when we don't want them? We're not just going to cut them loose. We're going to find them another club. We're going to mentor them. We're going to look after their well-being. And imagine the difference when you're 8 or 10 or 12 as a young player, to find that Postecoglou comes and watches your game. Or when you sign a contract, even if it's just schoolboy terms, the senior manager takes the time to take 5 minutes and shake your hand and say, I'll see you in 5 years. Or the club tell you in the pitch before you join, we've got a plan for you if you succeed, and we've got a plan for you if you leave. And this is what Tottenham are doing really well, and 1 or 2 other clubs like Liverpool as well. So I think that breeds a very talented group of players then, because they trust that they're going to get a shot, and they trust that they can go elsewhere if they don't. And when you have that connection, it means Postecoglou's not just thinking, when I need a young player, I'll ask someone in the under-21s and I'll get given a name and I'll promote them and I'll take a gamble. Postecoglou will be in touch with these players. He'll know them. He'll be speaking to them. He'll be watching videos of them. So he'll have probably known last season which of these young players he's going to integrate into the first team squad this season. It won't be just an overnight decision. And that's why I think that we will see some of these young Spurs stars given big opportunities in the next 12 months.
Yeah, Joe, I can't help but say, Ben, just listening to you there, it's just absolutely fascinating stuff. And you know what, I'm going to come on to a name now that I know many have been on tenterhooks to hear you talk about, because there's lots of speculation over his future this summer and where he's going to go. And that is, of course, in 𝐅𝐸 𝐂𝐨. We understand he is one of Spurs' most desired targets this summer. And we have heard reports that Spurs are expected to up and accelerate their interest in 𝐂𝐨 after the Euros. Now, there are reports out there that Spurs will need to be prepared to pay a considerable amount of the fee up front, a fee that in total could exceed £60 million GBP. We understand the player does have a release clause in that contract, but we also understand there are complications as to how that release clause is triggered. So, be interested to know from you, Ben, how genuine Spurs' interest is, if there are any other clubs involved, and how you see this move panning out between now and its conclusion.
Yeah, I think the good news for Spurs fans looking for some box office news is that 𝐅𝐸 𝐂𝐨 is a big one and a priority. And I think that Spurs would love to get this one over the line. Like you say, they're going to have to be a little bit patient because of the Euros. There is a release clause in the region of £65 million. And triggering it, I think, will be equally as complicated as with Michael Olise, who's on his way to Bayern. And the reason for the complication is, one, you go through Palace. And I know that might sound strange, because why wouldn't you go to the club that are selling, right? But so many deals start with an informal inquiry on the player side, try and agree terms, then make a bid. And that's legal. It's not tapping up. You obviously are transparent about it. Crystal Palace would know what Tottenham are doing. But in this case, it's a bit more structured. And as with 𝐅𝐸, the expectation is that you put down a formal inquiry to Palace, and then they're not just the seller, but almost the intermediary. And then they will present the opportunity to Eze and give you formal permission to speak to him. And then from there, the negotiation starts. And because 𝐅𝐸 is gone, it is very possible that Crystal Palace demand either the release clause to be triggered or alternatively the same kind of valuation. So I don't think this is a deal that gets done in the 50 millions or less. It's a 65 million deal. But unlike, say, a Kilman, and we spoke about this before, I think it might still be the kind of number that Daniel Levy sees value at. The challenge is more the fact that Crystal Palace are flying, and a lot of these players are quite settled now. And Eze might return back to Palace for pre-season and just decide that he's happy enough where he is. Maybe he can even use the possibility of interest to get improved terms. But I think that Tottenham are going to try for this one. They're really big fans, and they've got a good relationship with Crystal Palace as well. And remember too, the agent is base, and half of Tottenham seem to be base. I think it's Maddison, Son, Postecoglou even is based, to my knowledge. Apologies if I'm getting these agencies wrong. I should know them off the top of my head because we're plugging them all the time. So yeah, I mean, Tottenham is basically base FC, which would give them ability to do a deal with a strong relationship on the agency side and on the Crystal Palace side as well. Arsenal have taken a look. I'm not aware that they're yet as serious as Tottenham. And at the same time, as you might expect, there's other clubs like Liverpool and Newcastle United and even Chelsea that have had him under consideration. And that's why I think that after the Euros, there will be quite a structured element to this where the agency side and Palace will let on. If you're going to bid, the player wants you to do it now, so everyone knows where we stand. And then he may either sign a new deal, just stay, or obviously some kind of deal around the 60 to 65 million mark. But Tottenham will try for this one. Tottenham will push for Eze, as far as I'm aware. They're just biding their time because they know that this is the wrong point within the window to be distracting Eberechi Eze. The second thing that I wanted to raise is the complication in the release clause with 𝐅𝐸 was the fact that it wasn't just the number, but the fact that a percentage went to Reading, or does go to Reading from the buy-in deal, and another percentage goes direct to 𝐅𝐸. And if Eze's release clause is the same, and unfortunately at this point I can't confirm it, I've been told they're similar by Palace sources, but I can't confirm this point. But if they turn out to be identical, then it will mean that Eze gets a percentage of the release clause should it be triggered. And that obviously incentivizes him to also recommend that that is how things are done. And if you don't trigger the release clause, your personal terms are harder to navigate and negotiate because Eze may say, well, I'm going to make more money if you trigger the release clause. So you've either got to compensate me for that, or I want you to trigger the release clause because he's got a vested interest within the release clause because he may gain a percentage from it. So to be clear again, that's not confirmed yet by sources with Eze, but it is confirmed that the release clauses are similar. And it is confirmed in the case of 𝐅𝐸 that he does get a percentage of the release clause. So that can add a slight plot twist in terms of how easy it is to agree personal terms. So I think we should be coming back to this one in a couple of weeks, in mid or late July or early August. And I do think that Eze will end up being one of Tottenham's priority targets.
Can I just have as a follow-up on that, Ben? I don't know whether Matt's also got a feeling on it. Do you, Matt, want to go first? Did you have a follow-up on that one? Oh, thanks. I just was wondering from my perspective, Ben, you know, it's not as easy as it looks. Pay the release clause, you get the player. You've explained very eloquently there just the nature of the different interpretations as to how a release clause can be triggered and the different aspects of that. Do you have an indication or a feeling, Ben, you feel this one is going to run towards the very end of the window? Because just the nature of this kind of deal, it does seem very complicated. And we've seen in the past, Spurs don't do complicated deals that well in the past. Although they have, listen, they put off 𝐷𝐷𝐺 as a signing, which I know many are excited about. And before that, they have got some fairly high-profile players over the line, if you call them that, the likes of James Maddison as well. Gut feeling, Ben, is this one going to run? Or do you think with a release clause in there, it should be easier to get a deal done quicker?
Yeah, I don't think it'll run. Ultimately, 𝐅𝐸 didn't run. It was structured. So there's complications. So the first thing you do is understand the complications, and then that mitigates it dragging on because there's no surprises. And that's why you go through the front door and talk to Crystal Palace. The second thing is it runs on because you've got to be respectful to 𝐅𝐸𝐸 𝐂𝐸 and ultimately make your approaches at the right time so as not to distract him. But once we get to the point of anybody bidding, whether Spurs or any other club, it will resolve itself very quickly, I'm told, because Palace don't want it to drag out. Suitors don't want it to drag out. 𝐂𝐸 doesn't want it to drag out. So the reason it may be smoother is because everyone's had time to understand the lay of the land, what the best way is of approaching 𝐂𝐸 and Palace, what the terms are within the release clause, whether or not they're going to have to pay the release clause or a deal is there to be had at a lower number. So then by the time you actually make a formal approach, you know what you're in for. And that should lead to a very smooth process. So 𝐅𝐸𝐸 was like a paradox because it was a complicated clause and it was quite a convoluted process, but most of it happened behind closed doors in the 2 or 3 weeks before anyone even realized that there'd been any formal approaches. Then there were the approaches, and within about a week, 𝐅𝐸𝐸 was off to Bayern. So I would just sit tight on this. We might not hear news today, tomorrow, but as soon as we hear that people are bidding, I think all the suitors will come out the woodwork at the same time as they did with 𝐅𝐸𝐸. And then from that point, it won't drag on. So if it was to happen in the next 2 weeks, then there's a fair chance, obviously, that he might be at a new club before the end of July, which should be his preference, any player's preference, because you want to try and move in the heart of pre-season so you can settle before the season gets underway.
I have to say, Ben, I really appreciate the incredible insight into what actually goes on behind the scenes, because I think from a fan perspective, it's easy to see Tottenham are monitoring, Tottenham are interested in, Tottenham are considering, and not actually appreciate the complications that are going on and the complexities of actually getting a deal done. So we really do appreciate that insight. I do want to ask you, before we talk about another potential incoming, about some players whose future at Tottenham may be a little bit unclear. Troy Parrott had a brilliant loan spell at Excelsior last season. Unfortunately, couldn't keep them up in the Eredivisie, but scored 10 goals in 25 league games. Alejo Veliz, who went off to Sevilla after getting his first Premier League goal and couldn't get too many minutes there. And Manor Solomon, who spent the majority of the season on the sideline. What do you think the future holds for that trio?
Yeah, I think with Solomon, Spurs still like him, as you say, sidelined for much of the season, and they still feel that he can recapture the form that he had before ultimately Tottenham made that move. You've not really seen Manor Solomon, the player, at Tottenham comparative to before he joined. So he still has legs, in my opinion. With Parrott, the loan spell at Excelsior, I thought went relatively well. And the development there was quite subtle. It was about using his brain more than his feet to get in better positions. And Tottenham have made this point as well, that he's got a lot of good technique, but the speed of feet doesn't quite match the speed of thought. So what they were trying to do in that loan spell, under a bit less pressure and at a lower standard, obviously, than Tottenham, was get him into areas quicker and anticipate not just ball to feet or run. Those are the easy kind of parts, but the kind of move before the move. And you're going to see this with Enzo Maresca. And we also know that Pep's like this, where football's a game of chess. So don't just think about the move, think about the move before the move. And that's the part of Parrott's game that they want to get out of him. The not just, I'm going to do this, or the ball's going to go here, but the defender might do this and then this. So if I go here, then there, that will actually eventually and inadvertently result in the space that I need to do some damage. So they spent a lot of one-on-one time with him. But then, unfortunately, he picked up a hamstring injury this year, and there were some issues with discipline as well. And Tottenham need to factor all of that in as well. So there's a player in there somewhere, but I think pre-season is going to be key to determining whether or not he has a future at Tottenham within the first team squad. And I don't really have any indication yet as to any other interest or a next kind of step, to be honest. And with Alejo Veliz, nothing major to add, to be perfectly honest with you. It all seems relatively quiet on that front. He's still only 20 years of age and is very rated by Tottenham. Another forward that has impressed for Argentina at under 20 level. And I think it's going to be about pathways for him. As you rightly said in the question, he had a loan spell at Sevilla, who he joined from February. And it was interesting because they gave him the number 10 shirt, which shows you the kind of potential that they think he has. So I think Tottenham are also of the belief that another loan may be necessary, and then they'll be able to judge his future and his pathways a little bit more clear. I think there's other interest coming from La Liga. I heard that Bologna were quite keen on the player as well in a straight loan, or even a loan with an option to buy. To be perfectly honest with you, I've not gone to sources and asked with both Parrott and also Valise what Spurs' valuation would be, or whether they would consider at this stage in their development any kind of permanence to a deal. So maybe that's something that I can do offline and report back. But there's definitely development still needed for those players before I think they would be thrown in at the deep end as far as any Spurs minutes are concerned. But it wouldn't surprise me if they form part of the early pre-season plans, so Ange Postecoglou can look at them firsthand.
Yeah, it always feels like day one of pre-season when those pictures come out, those players walking into Hotspur Way. It causes a lot of a stir, thinking, are they going to be there long term? Are they just coming in for the first day? It's always interesting, so I appreciate that. Ben, we're going to look to bring things on forward to the forward area now in terms of what Spurs might be looking to do in that striking area. A name that has reportedly been definitely added to Spurs' striker shortlist is that of Jonathan David, a name that has been very much banded around social media over the course of the last week. Now, the prolific forward did enjoy another strong season for Lille last term, hitting 26 goals in 47 appearances across all competitions, starting in 40 of those outings. Straight question to you, Ben. Can you see this guy being a Spurs player? Because when you look at his record over the course of the last 3-4 seasons, he has been ultra consistent.
Yeah, I can see him being a Spurs player. I think Spurs are one of the front runners for Jonathan David. There's 4 Premier League teams that are in the mix. You've got Chelsea, even though they've signed a couple of young strikers, Tottenham, West Ham and Manchester United. Manchester United at the moment are the most distant because they're focusing on Joshua Zirkzee, and the other 3 could still move. And this isn't anything new. I think I did a show about a year ago where I said, Jonathan David and Spurs, watch it. And this is again because Fabio Paratici's been there pre-Postecoglou, and there is some consistency in terms of recruitment targets. So there was an outside chance that an offer would have been placed for Jonathan David 12 months ago by Tottenham, but the price was too high. The key thing that's changed now is that David's heading into the final year of his contract, and Lille know that he's not going to renew, and they accept that it's better to take a fee now than risk losing him on a free transfer in a year's time. And because there's only that 1 year, Lille are not being bullish anymore. So you might think that there's like a formula and that there's a depreciation, and it wouldn't be that steep between 2 years left and 1 year left. But 2 years left, the club's got all the cards because it's long enough they can ask for what they want. And it's long enough that they might get a renewal. So Lille were looking at 45 or 50 million pounds a year ago, whereas now the price is going to be under 30 million. And with the right structure, it might even be closer to 20 million. And that's an astonishing bit of business for any club. For, as you say, a striker that's scored 26 goals in all competitions in the last 2 seasons. So Tottenham are looking at both Jonathan David and still Santi Jimenez as well. I know we'll come on to these other names in a moment, so I'll stick with David for now. Chelsea have also opened exploratory talks with Lille and approached the player camp. And everyone's been told at this stage that David wants to complete the Copa America with Canada and then decide on his future. So watch this space, because I think that others we've said, and we sound like a broken record, I know, and I say we because I'm sure it's not just me. The amount of times on this podcast you probably hear, that's not a Daniel Levy deal, or that's not a Daniel Levy price. But in the case of Jonathan David, it's both a Daniel Levy deal and a Daniel Levy price. And that's why I think that Spurs will be seriously in the conversation for Jonathan David.
That's a bingo. Have you seen one, right? That's a bingo. Over to you, Matty.
Another forward name that is being thrown about for Spurs and a number of Premier League clubs is Alexander Isak. And the reports that Tottenham have offered Richarlison plus money for the Swedish forward. However, Newcastle rejected the proposal. We believe that Isak is happy at the club and is under contract for another 4 years, but Newcastle may be in a position where they have to make a huge sale by the 30th of June. We call it deadline day 0.5. Richarlison's injury record has seen him miss 20 matches across the past 2 seasons, with other games when he was not fit enough to play more than a handful of minutes, meaning Tottenham would listen to any serious offers for him this summer. How realistic do you think this is, Ben, between Richarlison and Isak?
Totally unrealistic. What's more realistic is me getting a date with some supermodel or some wildly gorgeous celebrity deciding that Ben Jacobs is her world. There's just no chance that Isak is leaving Newcastle. That's what I'm told. It is a completely impossible or near impossible type scenario, unless someone wants to drop 115 to 130 million and then Newcastle's hand may be forced. I think when we say Isak is happy at Newcastle, we should add Isak is ambitious and will eventually want to play Champions League football. So I'm not ruling out a move in the years to come if Newcastle go back-to-back seasons without European football. But right now, it's an automatic rejection from Newcastle United. It's as simple as that. And there are so many other names that Newcastle will sell if in the next few days they need to raise money for PSR. Even Bruno Guimaraes is ahead of Isak on the list of players that if Newcastle were forced to, they would lose. And the only real reason for that is because they got plenty of midfielders. Sandro Tonali comes back from the ban, Elliot Anderson, Lewis Miley, Sean Longstaff, Joe Linton can play in midfield or the front three. So if they had to pick between Bruno or Isak, they'd pick Bruno, but they don't want to lose both. And they're going to be really fierce in any negotiation and shut down any kind of offer. And if anyone thought the door was open, then you wouldn't only have Spurs moving, you would have Chelsea and probably Arsenal as well. But it's going to be a massive, massive twist. Probably the biggest single story in this window if Isak leaves, because he's either going to leave because Newcastle completely U-turn in their position, or he's going to leave because somebody puts a British transfer record number on the table. And that is simply not Daniel Levy to say, let's do Isak at 115 million instead of Jonathan David at 25 million. But it's also not Arsenal or Chelsea at this point. So I think Isak is going to stay at Newcastle. And I would just add that a bit like we said before with Leeds, and I'm deviating, I know, a bit, and I suppose Spurs fans don't really care about Newcastle's finances, but in the same way that Leeds don't need 100 million, Newcastle don't need 100 million either. To satisfy PSR concerns, you're looking at 30 to 50 million. So if they sell Isak or Bruno, they're giving themselves leeway of 40, 50, 60 million that they can spend in the market. And if they only need 30 to 50 million, they'll get Minter out the door. Everton still want him. Lyon had made an approach. Let's wait and see whether anything gets over the line. Trippier, not unthinkable that Bayern come back. Longstaff, Lascelles, Callum Wilson, all players in the market that could be sold. Dubravka, even a possibility that he could depart. So to get to that number, they can do it in other ways rather than being forced to sell Isak. And for Spurs and every other club, we should note 30th of June is not a hard deadline like on deadline day. You can have near misses. So as long as you show you started the negotiations and you made your offers and you tried to get the deal sheet in by the 30th of June, if it gets done on the 1st of July, even the 14th of July, you can still classify it on this financial year and likely from a legal point of view, gain approval from the Premier League when they look through the books. So I think Isak's off the table. I would forget about it. I would go to bed. I would dream about it. I would fantasize about it in football terms, of course. And then I would forget about it when you wake up. With other names, Ivan Toney, Tottenham sources are adamant there was no bid made. With Solanke, there's a 65 million release clause. But again, it's being shot down by sources that I'm speaking to. With Victor Gyökeres, I think that might be one more for Arsenal than Tottenham. It's a huge outlay, though, either way. With Zirkzee, I think he's going to go to Manchester United or Milan. With Nico Williams, I know we're deviating slightly from out-and-out forwards. The overall cost is too high. There's a very marketable release clause number at about £45 million, but you've got taxes on top. And the player's going to want in excess of 200k a week. So that's not a deal that Tottenham are working on. But Santi Jimenez is still there as well. So I think Jimenez and David are two concrete striker options as far as Tottenham are concerned.
Can I just ask you, Ben, if the Richarlison to Newcastle, if that's off the table and unrealistic, and Tottenham are still listening to offers, it's something that doesn't seem to go away, even though it seems like something that Richarlison wouldn't do, and that's interest from Saudi clubs. And I suppose we can open it up to the entire Spurs squad as well, because I know Tottenham fans have been somewhat annoyed that the players that we've wanted to get rid of haven't really attracted the attention of Saudi clubs, like the luck that perhaps that Chelsea have had with getting some players out there. What can you tell us at the moment about any Spurs players that the Saudi Pro League might be interested in?
Yeah, Richarlison is the one to watch. We mentioned Emerson earlier as well, and Al Nassr. With Richarlison, it would be a central deal. So without sending you to sleep, or maybe you want to be sent to sleep because it's 10:30 already. So we are running into injury time, I know. But the Central Saudi deals, they get done without an allocated club often, because several clubs say we'd like the player. And when it's a big name like Richarlison, the central deal makers take over. And then if they agree with the player or with Spurs, they then allocate the club at the last minute. And this is why Nacho was Al Ittihad and suddenly signed for Al Qadsiya, and why N'Golo Kante thought that he was joining to play for Al Nassr, but ended up playing for Al Ittihad because they were in the Club World Cup. So don't fixate too much on linked Saudi clubs unless they're smaller deals, because when it's Emerson and Al Ahly, it may be because Al Ahly can afford that. But when it's Richarlison and they need a big fee and very high wages, it will all come from the central pool of funds. And the talent ID is led by Michael Emenalo, who of course used to be at Chelsea. And this is why it's often mysterious, and why a central Saudi deal maker can come to a club like Spurs and say, who have you got? And then bulk shop. And the interesting thing about Saudi Arabia for this summer is that the quota of foreigners has increased from 8 to 10. But 2 of those foreigners, if you want to fill the full 10, have to be 21 years of age or younger. And people presume that Saudi are just going to buy young and try and get some of the stars of the future. But that's not my understanding. My understanding is that Saudi will consider loans because they like the idea that a Tottenham player, like we said, Parrott before, may not be ready for first team football, but could be loaned to Al Nassr and play for a season alongside Ronaldo. And Spurs fans might care more because they're actually watching one of their players develop and play every week, rather than getting rid of a player that's of an older age. And then why would Tottenham fans care? If Emerson departs to Saudi, you're not going to get many fair weather Spurs fans that just love football and want to stay up on a Thursday night and watch Saudi football. But you might be more inclined to do that if your star 19-year-old striker was loaned to Saudi Arabia for one season. And I think this helps Saudi decide on a strategy that says, we want the best players, we want to bring stars to Saudi, but we'll also borrow stars if it helps build the brand and open up the league to a wider international audience. So when deal makers speak to Spurs, and I'm not aware that they've had those meetings yet, but inevitably they'll come because the bases are set up in France and Spain and in England, and all the clubs visit. Al Ittihad were in town this week, and they'll use their time in London to meet people and explain this. So then when they're talking to senior people at Spurs, it will be not just who can we buy, but who can we loan? Or alternatively, who do you want to get rid of? And there might be 5 or 6 of the options that we've mentioned that are all just bulked in. And then obviously they'll pay whatever it takes within reason, and it becomes a win-win. So 12 months ago, many people thought that Saudi was the problem because Fulham were really annoyed about Mitrovic leaving, and then Willian signed a new deal and then immediately wanted to go to Shabab. Liverpool lost their captain in Jordan Henderson. Everyone said Chelsea was somehow doing backhanders, even though they weren't. When Mendy and Koulibaly went to Saudi, everyone questioned Alan St-Maximin and how Newcastle could do business with another PIF club. And surely that fee is going to be sky high. And yet the irony of ironies is the most eye-browsing fee at the time was Chelsea selling Kai Havertz to Arsenal, and nobody said a word. So it just sort of shows you that the Saudis are very westernized. They've got a lot of experienced people behind the scenes that maybe not everyone knows about, that know the European market and will know Tottenham very well. And at some point this summer, they'll come to Spurs and they'll work out who's available. And they might do more than one deal. There'll be separate deals, but they'll all be negotiated centrally. And then maybe one or two players like Chelsea did will be farmed off to different clubs. So with Richarlison, keep an eye on the PIF clubs, because if he goes, he's only going to go there. And I'm told that Al-Ittihad are the ones to watch. And Ramon Planes is the sporting director there, who Tottenham fans will know, and he worked under Pochettino. And it's quite interesting as an aside, because Ittihad need a new manager because they've just got rid of Marcelo Gallardo, and they're not looking at Pochettino at the moment, but they're running through lists of people and they're not finding agreements. And Planes and Pochettino like each other, and you never know. Pochettino might get an offer out the blue. I don't think he'd go to Saudi, by the way, but that's just a subplot. And then Richarlison might end up having an opportunity with Ittihad, I'm told. The other club could be Al Hilal. It will depend maybe on whether they get Kevin De Bruyne. If they get him, then Richarlison, so there's balance, will be sent elsewhere. So Saudi Arabia could be a bit of a solution for Tottenham in many ways, an opportunity to get rid of a couple of players if they're willing to go there, maybe even loan a couple of players. But the big story might be an offer from Saudi for Richarlison. And if it's at the right number for Tottenham, which I would think would be in excess of 50 million, maybe even a little bit more, then I do think they would give serious consideration to that.
Ben, we spoke last time you were on, and the time before that, about different investment opportunities that were there with companies looking into buying part of Tottenham. And Tottenham recently have reportedly been in talks with MSP Sports Capital for a potential investment that could result in a stake in the football club worth up to 40% to the US group. Their current portfolio includes European clubs such as Brøndby in Denmark, Augsburg in Germany, Estoril of Portugal, and even outside of football, McLaren F1, also part of their portfolio. Do we know how genuine these talks were, and indeed if they ever even actually took place?
Yeah, I think Tottenham are always very discreet, and we have to respect that, even as journalists. So the first thing to say is, with MSP, long rumoured to be in talks with Tottenham, Tottenham spokesperson on record has made it very clear that there are no active talks at the moment with MSP over full takeover or minority investment. And we need to reiterate that, because as reporters, we have to be balanced. And you always hear whispers in the investment world, and there'll always be meetings and informal chats. And there's no doubt that Daniel Levy knows the MSP people very well. But I think the indication that nothing is moving on the Spurs front, and backing up the club spokesperson's position, and that's on record, so we're not having to disguise the source. A Tottenham spokesperson has made it categorically clear on record that there are no talks currently with MSP over outright or over minority. And I think what backs up that is the fact that whilst those rumours were breaking, MSP were fronting a consortium to try and buy Everton. And it wouldn't be normal in investment circles to be bidding for two Premier League clubs at the same time. So if anything was to develop with MSP, first of all, it would be fresh as of now. And second of all, it would be after the Everton debacle, and MSP were not successful in that. Instead, it's going to be Dan Friedkin, the owner of Roma, providing exclusivity goes well. But you never know. So MSP are not going to give up on Everton either. They're going to wait and see what happens with the exclusivity. And if skeletons come out the closet and that doesn't get over the line, they'll still be there and retain an interest in Everton Football Club. So I think MSP is off the table for now. The thing that I'm told is there's full clarity, and I believe Daniel Levy referenced this in the last financial statement, that it will not be an outright and there will be no surrendering of any majority stake. It will only be minority, and it will be strategic partner. So we're kind of looking at what FSG did rather than what Manchester United and Sir Jim Ratcliffe did. What I know at the moment is that there's no Saudi interest. I'm sorry to say for those of you in the chat, I think Saudi are very serious contenders, whether PIF or another entity, to buy Monaco. Even though we hear rumours about Marseille, I think it's Monaco and I think it's France that Saudi Arabia really want to make their next big play in. And PIF have a funny story for you. Central Acquisitions Department And even if it isn't PIF, you still got to get the blessing, because that's the nature of the region. In the same way that Sheikh Jassim wanted Manchester United, Nasser Al Khalifi and QSI were not directly involved, but you still got to get their blessing. So everything will ultimately go through this government-run entity, whether it's private or whether it's not. And they're so secretive that Steven Gerrard's Al Ittifaq are going to be taken over by a Saudi entity as part of a pre-planned privatization. The Ministry of Sport have said publicly that more than 4 clubs will be private entities. And at the moment, Gerrard's club, they're owned by the Ministry of Sport, but they're going to be privatized. And that deal is ongoing at the moment. And the entity is known within the Ministry of Sport and from people connected to PIF. But senior figures at Ittifaq, even though it's nearly a year in to the acquisition, have got no idea who the owner is or who the Saudi company is. And when they don't know, it's shrouded in secrecy. So the very fact that we've been able to dig and find out that Saudi want to move in French circles is quite significant, but they're not in the conversation for Tottenham. Qatar was a different story, you may remember, as I exclusively broke. QSI were in exploratory, keyword, minority state talks to buy somewhere in the region of 15% of Spurs, and nothing happened. And again, even though it goes against my reporting, I should be fair to Tottenham and say they denied my story, but it was picked up by a wide array of media backing up my position. But we should always be respectful and say Tottenham were approached and Tottenham denied that as well. So it shows you how discreetly that they work. Now, I'm told Levy is looking in US circles, and the most likely investor for Tottenham will be in that kind of Arctos mold. So Arctos came into PSG, they bought just over 10%. They're a relatively silent partner, but on big things like infrastructure and brand growth, they have more of a say, and they lend their expertise from another sector, and they really help modernize the brand and grow it. But they don't get heavily involved in football decisions. They don't get heavily involved in transfers. They don't get sucked into the gritty day-to-day stuff that gets dealt with at leadership level. And that's the kind of partner I'm told that Levy wants. Somebody that can safeguard the club, move it on, maybe provide experience from a slightly different sector, maybe in the case of Arctos, and I'm not saying Arctos specifically, but maybe like Arctos, there's some other clubs. So you kind of get an element of the multi-club, but it's different, right? Because if Levy sells outright into a multi-club model, you think about the pyramid. Whereas if you bring on board a strategic investor with experience in football or some kind of irons in other clubs, then you get the connections, but you don't have the same complications under the rules because you're not strictly multi-club. Your strategic investor is multi-club, and it allows you to function as normal with the benefit of that bigger network without necessarily having to worry about a change of structure or personnel. So any investment is still going to be Daniel Levy, business as usual, same brand, same structure, same philosophy, same everything, but maybe 10 to 15% sold to allow Tottenham to have the funds that they need and the partner that they need to move the club forwards, less on the football side and more on the brand and financial side. That's my understanding anyway, but they're going to do it discreetly. And as much as we will try and push and dig, you do have to be respectful of that.
It's, again, absolutely fascinating listening to the nitty gritty of it. And it's almost as if Daniel Levy is a really intelligent businessman. I know some people don't like to hear that.
He is.
Yeah. Ben, just out of curiosity, you're speaking about investment from US groups there, and you look at teams like Birmingham and Wrexham who've had that, and even Bournemouth, I believe, having some investment from US athletes. Do you think there's a bit of an Americanization that clubs are potentially preparing for by getting more investment from US groups into English sport, and maybe look at the Super League again? It's much more of an American idea than what European sport is typically used to. So do you think maybe there could be a shift there towards that sort of approach to the future of football?
Yeah, I don't think it's an Americanization, although you make a fair point. And when you look at it from the outside in, it absolutely is, because we're getting a big influx of American owners. I think it's over half the Premier League now that have got some form of US owner. But the reality is the market's just right. And Levy's head was turned when Chelsea went on the market, and even during crisis and super speed, they got 2.3 billion. And then Manchester United goes on the market and even more. And these Premier League assets are few and far between. And there's a high enough volume of interest from America that the timing is just right to ultimately cash in. And if you can find a partner that doesn't interfere too much and helps move on the parts of the business away from football, it's win-win all round. And in fairness to Levy, away from the football, fantastic training facility, brilliant new stadium, non-sports business, NFL, all these little things get underrated. Because why would a Tottenham fan care that much that you've got an NFL game or that you're getting a Beyonce concert over Stamford Bridge? It's obviously not as good as 3 points. It's obviously not as good as a trophy. But they all add up. And eventually you become the destination because you've got the most modern stadium, the best hospitality, the best non-sports income. And all of that raises the price. And then eventually you go to market at a time where there's appetite and you're able to cash in. And if you choose to stay and cash in and remain invested in the club, then you can use that money to the benefit of the football club and grow its value even further and protect it. And I think this is what Daniel Levy does well. If they gave out trophies for being a tough negotiator, for increasing value, for growing brand, for building a modern stadium, then Tottenham's trophy cabinet would be full. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. I genuinely mean that Levy deserves credit for that. But eventually you have to loosen the purse strings and let it filter down to the football side. Otherwise, fans will always say, aren't we just doing things for the benefit of those that own the club and for the benefit of the infrastructure? But why not be a bit more risky? And why not open up that kitty to allow it to all filter down? Because fans pay their hard-earned money to see results. So I think that now is interesting because as much as it appears like everyone needs to get with the Americanization or this trend towards sovereign wealth funds, I think it's the opposite. That actually the investment firms in America in particular realize that it's now or never because the assets are few and far between. And Ratcliffe's not going anywhere for years. Eghbali and Clearlake and Bowley are not going anywhere for years. Yasser Al-Rumayyan and PIF are going to be staying for a long, long time. So how many more of these assets are going to come up? So if you can take 10, 15% of Spurs now, you better jump. And if Levy says this high financially, you better match it. Because if you don't, they're not going to come around that often. And that's also why Dan Friedkin thinks, I better take debt-ridden Everton with a new stadium. Because if I don't, when's it next going to come up on the market? And because of the World Cup, unlike the previous one in America that had no real legacy or impact, now I think people that are US firms think if I get in Europe now and in the Premier League now, in the build up to the World Cup, and then with the World Cup legacy, there's all manner of brand opportunities, including things like a game abroad in America. It won't go down well, and I can promise you it will not be a North London derby. But if you're an American Tottenham fan, how cool would it be to have a New York, North London derby? It would be insane. It would sell out 100 times over, and you could probably charge $500 a ticket. Now, if it happens, it will be softer and slower because we have to respect the domestic fan base and the heritage, and you have to pick the right fixture and not be too ambitious because there's that balance, isn't there, between what's right for the brand and what's befitting of Tottenham's culture and domestic fan base. And if I was a Tottenham or an Arsenal fan, then obviously I pay my hard-earned money. And part of why I pay my hard-earned money if I'm a Spurs fan is to watch Tottenham Hotspur rock up home and away and batter Arsenal 20-0. And if that opportunity is taken away from me and it's moved to New York, then I've got a decision to make. I either have to get subsidized travel and hotels and I accept it, or if that's not on offer, I have to pay another $3,000 to go on holiday to New York to watch the match of the season or the matches of the season. So it's never quite going to be that big or that quick. But if you eventually have a dominant US voice within the Premier League, then when it comes to vote, should we play abroad? You might get to that 2/3 majority needed because the American aspect overpowers the old school traditionalists. So there's a balance there to be had. But I don't think this is just about Spurs trying to Americanize to catch up. I think this is about America wanting a slice of the pie. And there's so few slices left that Spurs should be in a very strong position to get a fair amount of money for what will ultimately still be only a very small stake in the club.
Ben, I got a cheek asking you this. We've just gone over the 2-hour mark. We've got 2 quick fire questions to end it on. Can I just say, when you've got Ben Jacobs open up a transfer window, I don't really know. That bar has now been set so high, Matt. Where do we go from here? We just have to wait for Ben to return to close it, don't we, Matty? It's just been an incredible show, right?
It is. It always is. And I feel... I worry that sometimes when we say this all the time that the words lose a little bit of value when we say it over and over again. But Ben, we absolutely 100% mean it in every way. And, well, it's time for your favourite question. I know you know what I'm about to ask, but just in case any of the viewers are new and don't, Ben, between now and I'm going to use the phrase the window slamming shut, how many Spurs do you think? How many Spurs? There's one Spurs. How many players do you think Spurs will sign permanently?
Do you know what? I'm going to go quite high, which may sound odd, but before I do, I need to just clarify one technical point. Am I including or not including Timo Werner?
Ricky, you're the boss.
I mean, Werner's alone, isn't he? So I think if we say how many permanent signings do you think Spurs will make this window, Ben, that question might be a bit easy to answer. All
right, I'm going to simplify it. I'm going to discount anyone that's arrived, whether it's debatable they should or shouldn't be included. And I'm going to say between now, exactly now, 10:46 on Thursday, the 27th of June, and the end of the window, senior players, men's team, 5.
Okay, interesting. 5 players. You know
Ricky, we're going to be busy.
Yeah, it could be a busy window. Look, I've got to say, we're delighted that Ben's going to be joining us later in the window. For his own sake, we've obviously done a massive overview of the window here. I think for Ben's sake, it will not be 2 hours. We've taken so much of this man's time. But can I just say, whenever Ben comes on, the incredible amount of feedback we get whenever you're on, Ben, is absolutely remarkable. And look, I can only just say to you that the same people that joined this show at the start are with us at the end here. And there's nearly 4,500 of you that are watching this show. So I can't thank you enough for all your incredible support for the show. Matt, I'm sure you will agree. The barrier's been set fairly high in terms of what we've got to come, and we can't wait for Ben to rejoin us, right?
Absolutely, 100%. I agree with everything you've just said.
Yeah. Ben, well, it's a busy time for you. In normal circumstances, Ben, there's only one deadline day. You told us off air, there's probably 2, given the nature of the PSR deadline to come. Where can we follow you, Ben, and find you for, I'm sure, the inspiring, wonderful work you're going to provide over this window where we're going to have you towards the end of it?
Yeah, less concerned about me. I think you should flash up that football content awards to give yourself a big up, and I wish you well with that. I can't help you. I need to make this clear, but what I should say is I'm a judge for those awards, but not in that category. I've distanced myself from podcasts, so there's no conflict of interest, but I'm a judge in the best documentary category there. Okay. So I'll see you at the awards and hopefully you're victorious, but win or lose, it's got nothing to do with me. But if I did get a vote, it would be for you, but I'm not part of that process. So you don't need to be nice to me, but there we go. Football Content Awards. That's the most important thing. Scan the QR code. With me, there's a few things to say. At Jacobs Ben, my personal platforms, Talk Sports, where I also hold the title as Saudi or Middle East correspondent, which is why I'm relatively across the Saudi market. And I'm also a Premier League commentator there for the World feed. So you'll hear me weekly doing games around the world for TalkSport from the Premier League. And I've actually just taken on a new freelance role as well, along with the stuff I do for Caught Offside and the Debrief podcast, which I host with Fabrizio Romano and Angus Scott. I am carrying a written title now for Give Me Sport as senior football correspondent. I've been working with them for a couple of years, but I've now managed to wrangle myself a formal title. So that's going to see me do one daily bit of content, 30 pieces of content a month for Give Me Sport under the title of senior football correspondent. And there'll be some Spurs columns and features in there as well. But as I said before, it's not really about me. This is your show, and I wish you well in that award and keep up the good work that you guys do.
Listen, likewise, but I can only say it's been an absolute genuine pleasure, and the amount of love that pours in for you here is so truly deserved, mate. You're amazing. We love having you on. So thank you so much for opening up the window formally here on Last Word On Spurs. We've got more coming your way. Ben is going to be joining us later in the summer, where hopefully we've got a number of those 5 already over the line, and Ben is here just give us the scoops of what's left to come in where hopefully Spurs have done their business. From myself, wonderful Matty Hayes. Matt, thank you so much. We have been the last word on Spurs. From myself, from Matt, from Ben. Please take care. Please keep safe and keep well. And as always, come on, you Spurs.